I had always thought the idea of getting away from the city, even for a few days, would bring me a sense of peace. The constant noise, the endless movement, and the ever-present pressure of deadlines had worn me down. I wanted silence, the kind you only find in places where people are far away and the only sounds are the wind, the trees, and perhaps some distant wildlife. That's why I chose a cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, off-grid and isolated, surrounded by dense forest. It was advertised as a place where one could reconnect with nature, away from phones, internet, and people. At the time, the thought of it excited me more than it scared me. The drive to the cabin had been long and winding. My GPS stopped working miles before the cabin, and I had to follow a series of hand-drawn directions the owner had emailed me. They were crude but sufficient. Turn left at the fork in the road, continue until the old oak tree, then follow the dirt path until it ends at a clearing. The clearing opened up to a modest, wooden cabin, weathered and darkened with age. I parked my car and stepped out, the air sharp and cold with a faint scent of pine. The forest was silent in a way that felt unnatural at first. Not the soft, peaceful kind of quiet, but an expectant, watching quiet. Every snap of a twig under my boots felt deafening. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, with a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle and windows covered in grime and dust. I noticed a pile of firewood stacked neatly by the side, a metal bucket for water near the door, and the faint remnants of what looked like old animal tracks leading toward the forest. I dismissed the tracks at first as deer or other wildlife. I was too eager to escape the city to let a few animals bother me. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell of damp wood and old smoke filled my nose. The interior was simple, one main room with a wood stove, a table, a couple of chairs, and a small kitchen area. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom, both dark, with windows that allowed only minimal light. The air felt colder inside than it did outside, and I shivered as I walked through the rooms. I unpacked my small bag, placed it on the bed, and lit a fire in the stove. The warmth spread slowly but surely, and I felt a sense of comfort creeping in. I had brought canned food, bottled water, and a small camping stove as backup, though the cabin had a basic gas setup. My plan was simple: survive the first night, explore during the day, and enjoy complete isolation. No one could find me here, not that I wanted them to. The first night passed uneventfully, though the darkness outside pressed in against the windows, making the cabin seem smaller and more enclosed than I remembered in the daylight. I had gone to bed early, too tired to do anything but lie down and listen. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and an occasional animal call echoed through the forest, sharp and distant. I remember thinking how beautiful it all was and how foolish I had been to worry about isolation. I slept soundly until morning. Morning brought light, but also an unease I didn't recognize at first. The cabin seemed different. The smell was stronger, damp, metallic, like rust and something else I couldn't identify. My stomach tightened. I chalked it up to imagination. I stepped outside to stretch, hoping the fresh air would calm me. The forest looked the same, dense and green, but the tracks I had noticed yesterday were more distinct. And they were new. Fresh footprints pressed into the dirt and leaves led from the treeline to the cabin and stopped abruptly at the porch. They didn't look like deer tracks. They were human. My heart started racing. I looked around quickly, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. Nothing. I told myself it had to be a hiker or another visitor who had passed by, though the idea was unsettling. There should have been no one else out here, at least not at this time of year. The cabin's owner had said I would be alone. That was part of the appeal. I tried to push the thought aside, but it lingered. I spent the day exploring the surrounding area. The forest was thick, almost claustrophobic in places, with tangled underbrush and towering pines that blocked sunlight from reaching the ground. I found a small creek, clear and fast-moving, and a faint trail that led deeper into the woods. I made a mental note to follow it another day, though I felt a strange tension at the edges of my awareness, as if the forest itself was watching me. I told myself it was paranoia, the mind playing tricks in isolation. By nightfall, the unease had grown. I double-checked the locks, secured the windows, and kept the fire burning. Then I heard it, a scraping sound outside, soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind moving branches. But then it was closer, deliberate. Something or someone was moving around the cabin. My stomach dropped. I stayed still, straining my ears, every nerve on edge. The sound circled the cabin slowly, pausing at intervals. I didn't move. I didn't dare look. My mind raced with possibilities. A hunter? Someone lost? Someone with worse intentions? The rational part of me tried to calm my fear, but the primal part was screaming at me to get out. I spent hours that night crouched near the stove, keeping the fire alive, listening. Every snap, every creak of the cabin made me flinch. I didn't sleep. I didn't even dare to close my eyes. I kept a heavy branch near me, my only defense if someone tried to break in. The noises finally stopped around 3 in the morning. Exhausted, I waited for dawn with my eyes open, heart pounding, listening to the forest. When light finally seeped through the windows, I saw no sign of anyone. The footprints had vanished. I considered leaving immediately, but the road was long and the car was parked deep in the forest. The thought of walking out while someone or something was out there was worse than staying. I resolved to stay another day, but I would be vigilant. I explored the cabin carefully, checking every corner, every window and door, ensuring they were secure. Then I made a plan. I would set traps around the perimeter, not deadly, but something to alert me if anyone came near. I gathered cans and string, arranging them around the cabin. Small precautions, but they helped calm my mind. The following days were tense but uneventful. I explored during the day, marking the area with subtle signs so I would know if anyone entered my space. I collected water from the creek and supplemented my food with canned goods. The forest, once a place of beauty, now felt oppressive. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound set me on edge. I noticed signs of human presence, broken branches, fresh footprints, but never anyone in sight. I began to understand the depth of isolation and how quickly it could warp perception. Every day, I learned to distinguish between natural sounds and those that suggested human movement. My senses became sharper, my awareness higher, but so did my fear. Sleep remained elusive. Then, on the 5th day, something happened that changed everything. I had gone to the creek to fetch water. I noticed a faint glint between the trees, metallic and deliberate. Approaching cautiously, I found a makeshift campsite. There were remnants of a small fire, a few scattered cans, and footprints leading deeper into the forest. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching. I realized with a chill that I wasn't alone, that perhaps the previous footprints had been a warning, a way to unsettle me, to drive me out or to gauge my reactions. The thought made my skin crawl. I rushed back to the cabin, heart hammering, every sense on high alert. For the next 2 nights, the sounds outside increased. Footsteps, snapping branches, faint whispers carried by the wind. Though I was sure no one spoke. Someone was around, and they were cautious, avoiding direct confrontation. I began to notice subtle signs. Scratches on the porch railings, objects slightly moved, a piece of firewood missing. They were learning my habits, tracking my routines. Panic began to set in, but I forced myself to think. I could not let fear paralyze me. I prepared more traps, reinforced doors, barricaded windows with furniture, and kept a makeshift weapon nearby. I spent the nights listening, waiting, and learning the patterns of whoever or whatever was out there. Then, on the 7th day, everything changed. I was resting in the cabin, exhausted from constant vigilance, when I heard a sound that froze my blood. It wasn't outside, it was inside. A door creaked in the hallway. I grabbed my branch, my heart racing. The sound came again. Something had entered. I realized with horror that no barricade could stop someone determined. I considered my options: hide, fight, or escape. Escape meant going into the forest unknown and possibly trapped. Hiding might give them the upper hand. I decided on fight, using my weight and the branch as best I could. The footsteps grew louder. I could hear breathing, shallow, deliberate. Then silence. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I dared not move. I had been planning the trip for months. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods of northern Maine, far from any town or road, reachable only by a winding, half-forgotten dirt track that I had found on an old map online. I wanted to be alone, away from everything, to disconnect from the noise of life for a week. I thought I was prepared. I thought I knew what isolation felt like. I didn't. Not really. The drive there had been long, starting at dawn. My car, packed tightly with supplies, bounced over the uneven dirt road, surrounded on both sides by towering pine trees. I could see little breaks in the forest where the ground sloped sharply into hidden valleys. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of the sky, gray and heavy, like it was watching me. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds sang, no wind stirred the treetops, just the faint hum of my engine and the crunch of tires on gravel. It had a way of making the silence beyond the cabin feel suffocating, though I didn't realize it yet. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was low in the sky. The cabin was older than I imagined. Its wooden walls were weathered and dark, with moss creeping up one side. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were dusty and clouded. Still, there was a sense of permanence about it. Someone had lived here once, maybe even recently. The front porch creaked under my weight as I stepped out of the car. The air smelled of damp wood and pine needles, sharp and cold, like winter was breathing through the trees. I carried my bags inside. The interior smelled of dust, old wood, and something else I couldn't name at first, a faint iron-like tang. It wasn't unpleasant, just strange. The cabin was small. There was a single room with a wood stove in the corner, a table, a couple of chairs, and a loft above with a mattress. The windows let in little light, and the walls seemed to press inward, as if the forest outside was slowly closing in. I unpacked my supplies methodically. Canned food, bottled water, matches, blankets, and a few books. I wanted comfort, even if it was minimal. After a simple dinner of beans and rice, I decided to explore the property. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and orange, and long shadows stretched through the clearing. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, my boots crunching on the pine needles. The forest beyond the clearing was thick, almost a wall of dark green. I could hear the occasional rustle of small animals, rabbits, squirrels, or birds returning to their nests. But there was something else too, a faint, persistent sound like dragging or shifting, coming from deeper in the trees. My heart skipped and I paused. The sound stopped when I did. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just the wind or a deer moving through the underbrush. I didn't want to feel afraid on the first night. Returning inside, I lit the stove and sat near it, feeling the warmth seep into my legs. Night fell fully, and the cabin grew darker, shadows stretching across the walls. The forest outside seemed to breathe, slow and heavy. The sound from earlier had returned, this time closer, more distinct, like something large moving just beyond the treeline. I froze, listening. It was gone again. Sleep didn't come easily. Every crack of the wood, every creak of the cabin floor made me tense. I told myself I was overthinking it, that the forest had its own rhythms I wasn't used to. But even when my eyes closed, I could feel the presence of something out there, just beyond sight. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a fairy tale creature. It was real, tangible, and hidden. The second day, I decided to venture further. I packed a small backpack with water, a flashlight, a knife, and a basic first aid kit. The plan was to walk to the nearby stream marked on the map. The path was barely visible, overgrown with brambles and fallen trees. Every step forward meant pushing through branches and stepping over roots. The forest smelled wetter now, richer, like decay and growth at once. I felt like I was walking through another world. After an hour, I reached the stream. It was narrow, fast-moving, and cold. The water sparkled under the weak sunlight that managed to pierce the canopy. I knelt to drink some, the cold water shocking my hands and face. That's when I noticed tracks along the muddy bank. They were large, too large for a dog, and I couldn't identify them fully, though I knew they weren't human. My stomach tightened. Something was out here, moving, watching. I looked around. The forest seemed heavier, darker, more oppressive than before. I decided to head back, but I took a different route, hoping to explore more. That's when I realized I was lost. The trees, which had seemed familiar from the cabin, now all looked the same. Every direction was the same wall of green. My sense of direction failed me. Panic started to creep in, subtle at first, then climbing steadily. I called out, my voice swallowed immediately by the trees. No answer, of course, just silence and the occasional rustle of leaves. Hours passed. The sun was low when I finally stumbled across a faint animal trail that led me back toward the clearing. Relief washed over me, but it was mingled with exhaustion and fear. I made it to the cabin just as darkness fully descended. I bolted the door, sat near the stove, and tried to calm myself. That night, the sounds outside were louder. Branches snapping, something moving through the underbrush, heavy steps that made the ground tremble slightly. I stayed awake most of the night, gripping the knife I had left by my side, ears straining for any sign of what was out there. The next morning, I realized the situation was worsening. Supplies were limited, and I couldn't stay cooped up indefinitely. I had to confront the reality that whatever was out there, it was persistent and aware of me. I resolved to leave that day, but first, I wanted to gather my remaining supplies and secure the cabin. As I packed, I noticed something strange. Footprints around the cabin, large and deep, leading from the forest edge to the clearing. They weren't consistent, sometimes closer to the cabin, sometimes disappearing into the shadows. My heart sank. Whatever had been following me, watching, now felt bolder. I armed myself with the flashlight and knife, deciding to move carefully toward the car, ready to leave immediately. The walk through the trees was tense. Every sound made me jump. At one point, I glimpsed movement in the corner of my eye, a large shape slipping between the trunks. It didn't run, just moved, slow and deliberate, always keeping the cover of the forest. I pressed on, keeping my eyes forward, not daring to look directly. Finally, I reached the clearing and my car. The tires were intact, thank God. I quickly loaded my things, jumped in, and locked the doors. The engine roared to life. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it. A figure large and dark standing at the edge of the trees, watching. My breath caught, but I didn't stop. I drove off as fast as I could, tires spinning on the dirt, the forest disappearing behind me. By the time I reached the main road, the fear that had been coiled tightly in my chest started to unwind slightly. I was safe for now. I looked back once, half expecting to see it pursuing me, but the trees were empty. I realized that the forest, beautiful and wild, held its own dangers. Solitude was precious, but isolation could be terrifying. The experience left me shaken, aware that nature's threats were real, persistent, and sometimes invisible until too late. Weeks later, I returned to the city with a renewed respect for the wild. I told no one the details, not fully anyway. Some things are too real to share comfortably. I kept the cabin in my mind, not as a memory of fear, but as a lesson. Even in the quietest, most peaceful-seeming places, there is danger. And sometimes the scariest part is knowing it is real, not imagined, and could still be out there waiting. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. I needed to get away from everything, from the city, from work, from the constant noise and pressure that never seemed to leave me alone. I had found a small cabin online, deep in the woods, far from any town or main road. The pictures were modest, the descriptions straightforward, and the owner had promised privacy and seclusion. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed my old backpack, loaded my hiking boots, water bottles, food supplies, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and my camera. I even packed a few books I'd been meaning to read, the kind that made you lose track of time. The drive itself was uneventful but tense. As I left the last town behind, the road became rougher, narrower, and lined with tall trees that blocked the sky. The sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy, and soon, the forest seemed to surround me entirely. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin was supposed to be, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows that made the trees appear darker and more solid. I parked my car, noting how quiet it had suddenly become. The kind of quiet that isn't just the absence of sound but feels almost tangible, pressing against your ears, your chest, your mind. The cabin itself was small, built from dark wood that had weathered to a deep brown, almost blending with the surrounding trees. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, though I wasn't sure if anyone was there to tend a fire. The porch was simple, with a couple of chairs and a small table. I took my backpack and supplies inside. The air smelled faintly of wood and something older, perhaps mildew, or just the forest itself seeping in through cracks in the walls. The interior was plain, an open living space with a small kitchen corner, a bedroom with a single bed, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of damp. The windows had no curtains, only wooden frames that let in the dimming light of evening. I set about unpacking and making myself comfortable, lighting a small lantern to supplement the weak overhead bulb. I cooked a simple meal on the small stove, listening to the faint creaking of the cabin settling, a sound that was oddly unsettling in the silence of the forest. As I ate, I noticed how quiet it was outside. No wind, no birds, no insects, just an oppressive stillness that seemed unnatural. I shrugged it off as my imagination, the city always making a person feel alive, and silence now felt wrong to me. After eating, I decided to explore the surrounding area, even if just a little. The forest was dense, with thick undergrowth, fallen branches, and tall pines that blocked most of the sky. The ground was soft in some areas, covered with pine needles and damp leaves. I followed a narrow trail that seemed barely used, noticing how quickly the cabin disappeared from view. Every step I took seemed louder than the last. I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. It was then that I first noticed the tracks. Not human, not entirely, but something large and uneven. Deep impressions in the soft soil, spaced irregularly. I had read about wildlife in the area, bears, maybe even mountain lions, but these tracks didn't quite match any animal I could identify. They were too large for a deer, too deep for a coyote, and the spacing suggested a heavy, awkward weight. My stomach clenched. I debated turning back, but curiosity propelled me forward. The trail led me to a small stream, the sound of flowing water strangely comforting. I knelt to drink, refilling my water bottle and letting the cool liquid wash over my hands. That's when I heard the first noise, a low, dragging sound, like something being pulled through the underbrush. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I froze, scanning the trees. There was nothing, at least nothing visible, but the sound continued intermittently, always just at the edge of hearing. I convinced myself it was a branch or some animal, something natural. Still, I made my way back to the cabin quickly, my steps faster than before, the shadowed trees suddenly menacing. Back at the cabin, I double-checked the locks, even though the door had always been secure. I went through the small kitchen, checking that windows were latched. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a lonely place and my mind was playing tricks. I made some tea and sat on the bed with a book, pretending to read, but I couldn't focus. Every creak, every rustle outside made me tense. The daylight faded completely, leaving only the weak lantern glow and the dark shapes of trees pressing against the windows. Night fell fully, and with it came a new silence. No breeze, no wildlife, nothing but the occasional distant sound of water from the stream. But the dragging noise had returned, closer this time. I could hear it circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. My stomach turned. I remembered the tracks and realized they had to belong to whatever was making this sound. My mind ran through possibilities: bear, human, some creature I didn't know. I knew I shouldn't investigate alone, but my fear was laced with a kind of compulsive need to see what it was. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the porch, shining it into the dark. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing nothing but trees and the faint outline of the trail I had come on. Then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the light, something moved. Large, hulking, hunched over. It was impossible to see clearly, but I could make out the shape of long limbs dragging, awkward but deliberate. My heart was hammering. I backed into the cabin, locking the door again, trying to make myself believe it wasn't there. Hours passed slowly. I sat in the corner of the living room, flashlight in hand, the battery weak, listening. Occasionally, I would hear the drag again, sometimes accompanied by a low, guttural noise, almost a groan. I thought of my car just down the rough road. If I could get to it, I could leave, but the forest around the cabin seemed denser at night, impossible to navigate without light and without risking stepping into the unknown. I spent the night awake, alternating between bursts of sleep and wakefulness, always listening, always afraid to move too much. The next morning, light brought some relief. Shadows receded, the forest seemed less menacing, and the tracks were visible again in the soft ground outside. I inspected them closely and realized that whatever it was, it had been circling the cabin multiple times. The weight of it had pressed deep impressions into the soil, and some marks suggested attempts to climb the porch or reach the windows. My stomach sank further. I had to leave, but I needed a plan. I packed as much as I could carry, loading the backpack and leaving some supplies behind. I chose the road, hoping it would lead back to civilization. As I walked, I noticed signs of the creature everywhere. Broken branches, disturbed underbrush, deep scratches on tree trunks. My pace quickened. Hours passed, and the trail became clearer. Eventually, I reached a gravel road, a faint hum of traffic in the distance. Relief washed over me. I was safe, at least for now. By the time I reached the nearest gas station, I was exhausted, shaking, and my hands were raw from gripping the backpack straps. I told myself I would never go back. I bought water, some food, and a map, and began driving carefully back to the city. The experience lingered in my mind for weeks, replaying every sound, every shadow. I realized that what I had feared wasn't supernatural or made up. It was real. That cabin had been isolated for a reason, and the forest had its own rules and inhabitants, some far larger and more dangerous than I had anticipated. Weeks later, I read a local report about a large bear that had been wandering near a similar stretch of forest, attacking small animals and scaring hikers. It was never captured. The description matched what I had seen: its size, the dragging movement, the deep tracks. I felt a shiver, but also a strange sense of closure. I had survived, I had left, and I had learned that the forest, for all its beauty, could also be unforgiving. I never returned to that cabin, and I never went into that part of the woods again, but I carried the memory with me, a reminder that some quiet places hold real danger, and some fears are grounded entirely in reality. I had been planning the trip for weeks, a solo escape into the wilderness to leave behind the noise and the pressure of the city. I thought a week in a small cabin in the middle of the forest would give me the quiet I craved. The cabin was far from the nearest road, reachable only by a narrow dirt path that twisted between dense trees. When I first drove up, I remember thinking how isolated it was, and how perfect it would be for a week of nothing but the sound of the wind in the branches and the occasional bird. The cabin itself was modest, made of weathered logs with a steep roof and a stone chimney that looked as though it had been built decades ago. The windows were dusty, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and mildew, a smell I found oddly comforting. I unpacked my car, carrying in the boxes of food, my camping stove, and extra blankets. There was a small woodpile stacked neatly near the side of the cabin, and a rusty axe embedded in a stump. I decided I would need to cut some wood later. The cabin's interior was simple: a small living space with a table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, a tiny kitchen with a sink, a gas stove, and a small refrigerator that looked like it might barely work. A narrow hallway led to a tiny bathroom with a shower. I set my things down, trying to imagine a week of peace, of uninterrupted solitude. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire in the fireplace, boiled some water, and cooked a simple meal. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and almost solid. At first, it was soothing, but soon it began to feel like a weight pressing against my ears. Every small sound, branches scratching together, leaves rustling, the faint snap of a twig, was amplified in the silence. I told myself it was nothing, that the forest was simply awake while I slept. I went to bed early, the cabin cold but tolerable, the blankets warm against the chill of the wooden floor. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound that made my stomach tighten. It was soft, like someone moving slowly around the outside of the cabin, dragging something across the ground. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear, convincing myself it was an animal. The sound stopped after a few minutes, replaced by the usual creaking of the old cabin and the wind in the trees. I eventually drifted back to sleep, though my rest was shallow, filled with half-dreams of shadowed figures slipping through the trees. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was thick, the trees tall and close together, the ground covered in fallen leaves and small underbrush. There was a small creek nearby, its water dark and cold, moving slowly over smooth stones. I wandered along its bank, noting the way the sunlight broke through the canopy, casting patterns on the ground. It was beautiful and calming, but I couldn't shake a growing unease, a sense that I was being watched even when I was completely alone. That evening, I noticed something strange. As I was stacking more wood for the fireplace, I saw footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. They were large, human, and fresh. My heart rate spiked. I had locked the cabin doors when I arrived, and the only access was from the road, which was a 20-minute walk. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe another hiker had passed by, someone using the trail I hadn't seen. I told myself it was probably nothing, but I felt my sense of security slipping. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were locked tight, and then went inside, uneasy but unwilling to let fear dominate my night. As the days went on, the unease grew. I began hearing more sounds at night. Footsteps on the porch, something scraping against the side of the cabin, distant noises I couldn't identify. I started carrying a heavy flashlight and keeping the axe nearby, the weight of it reassuring in my hands. I also began noticing subtle signs that someone or something had been around. The footprints appeared again, sometimes near the back door, sometimes closer to the woods, always fresh. I never saw anyone, but the evidence of a presence gnawed at me, chipping away at the calm I had hoped to find. One afternoon, I decided to hike further into the forest, thinking that perhaps the exertion would calm my nerves. I followed an overgrown trail that led uphill, the trees thinning slightly as I gained elevation. The sun was beginning to lower, casting long shadows, and I felt an odd sense of being enclosed by the forest. The deeper I went, the more I felt eyes on me, though I could see nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight, and I noticed my breathing had become shallow and quick. I tried to focus on the trail, but every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves seemed unnaturally loud. Returning to the cabin, I found that my door was slightly ajar. My heart jumped, and I froze. I had locked it that morning before I left. Inside, everything appeared undisturbed. Nothing was out of place, no signs of forced entry. But the lock had been moved, a small but unmistakable proof that someone had been inside while I was away. I spent the evening barricading the door with a chair and double-checking the windows. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake, listening to the night, hearing distant footsteps and soft scraping sounds. The forest seemed alive, deliberate in its attention toward me. By the fourth day, I was tense, hyper-aware of every sound. I avoided the trail I had taken earlier, staying close to the cabin. I cut more wood, cooked meals, and forced myself to keep busy, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. But the intrusions continued. Footprints appeared closer to the cabin, and small items I hadn't touched seemed slightly moved. I realized I was being stalked by someone, though I still hadn't seen them. The idea made my stomach churn. Panic began to creep in, and I realized that my isolation, which had felt so peaceful at first, was now a dangerous vulnerability. One night, I heard someone walking on the porch. This time, I didn't stay hidden. I grabbed the axe and flung open the door, ready to confront the intruder. The porch was empty. I scanned the surrounding trees with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing nothing but trunks and shadows. But then I saw movement, a figure darting between the trees, staying just out of clear view. My heart slammed. I realized that someone had been watching me for days, waiting for me to let my guard down. I understood that calling the police or leaving immediately was my only chance. The next morning, I packed my things quickly, leaving no food or supplies behind. I loaded everything into my car, constantly scanning the treeline for movement. The forest seemed to hold its breath as I prepared to leave. I started the engine and drove slowly down the dirt path, every nerve alert. I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see someone running alongside the car. The drive felt interminable, each twist of the path revealing more of the empty, watching forest. Finally, I reached the main road. I pulled over, heart racing, and called the police to report the cabin and the stalking. They told me officers would come and investigate, but it would be hours before anyone could reach the location. I felt relief mixed with lingering fear, knowing that whoever had been following me could still be in the area, hidden among the trees. In the weeks that followed, I learned that the cabin had been used by a drifter who had a history of breaking into remote cabins. They never caught him while I was there, but other locals reported him in the area repeatedly. The police eventually removed him from the forest, and I never returned. The experience left me with a permanent awareness of isolation and vulnerability. I realized that the wilderness, while beautiful, could be unforgiving and dangerous, not because of spirits or myths, but because of other people, unpredictable and hidden, waiting in the shadows. I learned that caution and preparation are not just practical, they are essential. The fear I felt in that cabin was real, raw, and unforgettable, but surviving it gave me a new understanding of vigilance, resilience, and the importance of never underestimating the quiet threat of isolation. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of escaping the city and finding solitude in the woods had consumed me for weeks. I wasn't looking for adventure or excitement, just silence. A place where the only sound would be my own breathing, the wind through the trees, and perhaps the distant rustle of wildlife. The cabin I rented was deep in the forest, far from the nearest town, and reachable only by a winding, poorly maintained dirt road that became more like a trail the further I drove. My car struggled with the uneven path, tires slipping over loose gravel, the engine straining as I maneuvered around exposed roots and low-hanging branches. By the time I finally saw the cabin, dusk was already settling, the sun bleeding orange and red between the thick trunks of pines and oaks. The cabin itself was modest, a simple structure of weathered wood, with a slanted roof and a single stone chimney. A small porch ran along the front, and though the windows were dusty, they reflected the dimming light beautifully, giving the building an almost warm glow despite its isolation. I parked the car on the uneven clearing, the engine ticking as it cooled, and stepped out, feeling the chill of early evening sweep over me. There was a faint smell of pine sap mixed with damp earth, the scent of the forest in the late hours of the day. I carried my bag inside, noting the silence so profound it pressed on my ears. No birds chirped, no distant traffic hummed, nothing, just the quiet and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A small kitchen area sat to one side, a table with 2 chairs, a sink, and a stove that looked as though it hadn't been used in some time. A fireplace dominated the main wall, surrounded by stacked wood that smelled faintly of smoke and dust. There was a small living area with a worn couch and a single armchair, and a lofted bedroom with a mattress, a dresser, and a small nightstand. I set down my bag and started unpacking, placing food in the small refrigerator, and setting up my things neatly. I wanted to feel settled, to leave no corner of the cabin untouched, no sign that I was a stranger in a place that demanded attention. The first night was uneventful, though I barely slept. There is a difference between silence and stillness, and I could feel it pressing down on me. Every creak of the wood seemed louder than it should have been, Every snap of a branch outside sounded like someone, or something, moving just beyond the trees. I told myself it was just the wind, the normal sounds of the forest. I had read that even small animals could make noises that echo through dense woods. But still, the unease settled into my chest like a weight, and I found myself sitting by the fireplace, staring at the blackness outside, watching shadows stretch and shrink with the faint light of the moon. The next morning, I explored the area around the cabin. The land sloped gently down to a small stream, the water clear and cold, gurgling over rocks that glinted in the sun. Deer tracks were everywhere, and I saw the remnants of small burrows where rabbits and foxes must live. It felt like stepping into a different world, untouched by humans, and for hours I wandered, letting my eyes and ears drink in every detail. Birds called out intermittently. The wind carried the scent of moss and wet leaves, and the occasional rustle suggested the presence of life, unseen but near. I was content in the solitude, the fear of the previous night gradually receding. By the second night, however, a sense of tension began to return. The wind had shifted, blowing colder, carrying a dampness that penetrated the cabin walls despite the layers of wood. I noticed small things I hadn't before: the faint odor of something metallic, the way shadows moved differently in the corners of the room, as though the cabin itself were breathing. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, stacking firewood, cleaning the kitchen, but each time I stopped, the silence would press in again, and I would hear the faintest thud or scrape from somewhere outside. The mind has a way of exaggerating, and I kept reminding myself that the forest is never truly silent, that these sounds were nothing unusual. On the third day, I decided to hike further into the forest. The trail was overgrown in parts, and the sunlight barely reached the ground through the thick canopy. Every step I took produced a symphony of noises: twigs snapping underfoot, leaves brushing against each other, distant calls of birds and animals. But as I moved deeper, the noises became less frequent, the forest growing heavier around me. I felt watched, though I could see nothing, and my steps slowed. The wind had died down, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. When I reached a small clearing, I saw a fallen tree, its roots jutting into the air like skeletal fingers. I paused, feeling a shiver of unease crawl up my spine. Nothing was out of place, yet the hair on my arms stood on end. It was then I noticed the tracks. They were faint, partially obscured by leaves and dirt, but unmistakably human. They didn't follow a trail. They didn't lead to or from anything apparent. They just meandered in the clearing, looping back and crossing themselves in impossible ways. My stomach sank, and I took a careful step back, suddenly aware of the silence around me. The forest had gone still, every bird and animal apparently vanishing, leaving me alone with the tracks and the thudding of my own heart. I debated whether to follow them or return to the cabin. Instinctively, I chose the cabin. Safety in numbers, or at least in my own walls. Returning, I noticed small things I had never seen before. Footprints in the mud near the cabin's porch, a subtle scratch on the doorframe, the faint scent of smoke that wasn't mine. I checked the locks, made sure every window was secure, and for a while the cabin felt like a sanctuary again. But that night, the noises started. Not animals, not wind. Heavy footsteps circling the cabin, sometimes pausing just outside the windows, leaving shadows that I could almost trace if I pressed my face to the glass. I stayed in the loft, clutching a baseball bat I had retrieved from the car, heart racing. The sounds continued intermittently through the night, ceasing only in moments where I drifted into shallow sleep, waking to the sound of the wind or the creek to reassure myself it was natural. The following morning, I decided I had to leave. I packed quickly, knowing the road would be easier to navigate in daylight, but when I stepped outside, my car was gone. Panic surged. I ran to the clearing where I had parked, heart hammering, but there was no sign of the vehicle. The tracks in the mud were fresh, human, and they led away from the cabin into the forest, direct and purposeful. Someone had been watching me for days, following my movements, waiting. I thought of calling for help, but the cell signal was non-existent. The nearest town was miles away, over terrain I did not know and did not have the strength to traverse quickly. I realized I had a choice: stay in the cabin and wait for whoever it was to come back, or venture into the forest and hope to find my car, or perhaps some help. I chose the forest. I followed the tracks at a careful distance, keeping low and silent. The trail wound unpredictably over roots and through thick undergrowth. I stumbled several times, scratched myself on branches, and felt the strain of fear in my legs and arms. Occasionally, I would see glimpses of a figure ahead, just at the edge of my vision, always disappearing when I looked directly. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge overlooking a wider clearing, and there, partially obscured by trees, was my car. The door was open. Inside, there were signs of disturbance, but nothing had been stolen. Relief mixed with dread. Whoever had taken it had been inside, had seen me, but for reasons unknown, had left the car. I approached slowly, checking the area around the vehicle. The forest was quiet again, eerily so. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove back down the trail, I kept my eyes on the trees, expecting movement, expecting someone to appear at any moment. But nothing came. The road stretched out before me, muddy and uneven, but navigable. The sun was dipping toward the horizon, and I realized how lucky I was to be leaving at all. When I finally reached the nearest town, my hands shaking and my body still tense from adrenaline, I went straight to the police. They took my report, but without more evidence, there was little they could do. They offered to patrol the area, and I insisted they check the cabin, even though I knew I would never return there. Later, I learned from a local that the forest had been used for illegal activity in the past. Abandoned hunting camps and occasional squatters, people who sometimes watched outsiders to see if they could be taken advantage of. I had been a target, a stranger in a place where strangers were unwelcome. Weeks later, I returned home, the memory of the cabin lingering in my mind. Every detail replayed vividly. The smell of the forest, the way the shadows moved at night, the silence that pressed in until I could barely breathe. I learned to lock doors more carefully, to pay attention to small details in my surroundings, and to I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The cabin I rented was tucked deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest road, and even farther from the kind of people who made noise or left traces of civilization behind. It was late autumn, and the trees were bare, their skeletal branches cutting against the gray sky like black veins. I arrived just as the sun was beginning to slip beneath the horizon, painting the thin clouds in dull oranges and bruised purples. The gravel driveway had grown over in patches with grass, and the tires of my old sedan crunched loudly against stones and fallen leaves. There was something unsettling about the silence itself. It wasn't a soft silence, like in a library or a church. It was oppressive, heavy, almost physical, pressing against my ears as I got out and took in the cabin in front of me. The structure wasn't large. It was made of dark wood, with weathered siding and a pitched roof covered in moss and fallen leaves. A stone chimney rose from one side, blackened with age. The windows were dusty, and from the outside it was impossible to see what the inside looked like. I carried my backpack, a small cooler, and my flashlight up the steps, each creaking under my weight, and unlocked the door. A cold draft hit me immediately, carrying the smell of old wood, mold, and something vaguely metallic. The cabin hadn't been used in weeks, maybe longer. I pushed the door open further and stepped inside. The interior was small, maybe 3 rooms in total. A living area with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. Everything was coated in a thin layer of dust, and the air was damp. I set my bags down and walked around, testing doors and cabinets. Most were empty, except for a few shelves with old plates, some rusty pots, and a few cans of food past their expiration dates. There was a small woodpile outside, and a chopping block with an axe. I made a mental note to clear the snow from the path to get firewood later. The place had electricity, but the breaker box looked ancient. I didn't bother checking. This weekend I decided I would live off the basics. A fireplace fire, a lantern, and my supplies would be enough. By the time I had unpacked and stacked some wood, it was dark outside. The forest around me was black, the only light coming from the sliver of moon above. I decided to start a fire early. Lighting the kindling was not easy. The wood was damp, and I struggled for nearly half an hour before flames caught. Once they did, the warm glow filled the small room. Shadows leapt on the walls, making the interior seem larger and stranger than it really was. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, the sound of sizzling meat echoing in the silence. There was no wind yet, but the forest seemed alive. Every small crack or snap of a twig outside made my heart beat faster. I had no one around for miles, and even though I was a practical, level-headed person, the isolation weighed on me immediately. After eating, I cleaned the small cast-iron pan, stacked a few more logs in the fireplace, and settled into the bed with a book. It wasn't long before I started hearing noises outside. A branch snapping, maybe the wind, maybe an animal. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the words in my hands, but the sounds were persistent, irregular. It was one thing to know logically that wild animals were out there. It was another thing to hear something moving just beyond the fragile walls of a wooden cabin. Hours passed. The fire burned low. The sounds outside became harder to ignore. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving around the perimeter. I froze, straining to hear, my body tense. The cabin was small. Every sound seemed magnified. I grabbed the axe from the chopping block and held it close. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon or some other small animal. I stayed awake for the next few hours, firelight flickering over the walls, listening, waiting, my imagination threatening to turn every creak into something sinister. Morning came with a gray light. Outside, the forest was quiet, but tracks in the mud immediately caught my attention. Large footprints, human in shape but much bigger than mine, circled the cabin. My stomach sank. I hadn't expected anyone else to be in the forest. This cabin was remote. Whoever had passed through here hadn't been careful. They hadn't left evidence that suggested they were aware of my presence, but they had been close. I spent the morning checking all windows and doors. Everything was intact, nothing forced. The tracks were still there, but they led back toward the forest. I told myself I must be overreacting, that someone had passed through days before and hadn't seen me. I decided to explore a bit to calm myself. The forest was dense, with fallen leaves covering uneven ground. I followed a narrow path toward a small creek I had noticed on the map. It was peaceful, almost serene, until I heard a noise behind me. The unmistakable crack of a branch underfoot, close. My heart jumped. I turned slowly, but saw nothing. The creek gurgled quietly, the wind rustled leaves, but that sound had been deliberate, heavy. I moved back toward the cabin faster, every instinct screaming that I wasn't alone. The next day, I fortified the cabin as best I could. I stacked extra wood against the doors, moved heavy furniture in front of windows that could be forced open, and made sure my small knife and axe were always within reach. I didn't leave the cabin unless absolutely necessary. I spent the daylight hours walking the perimeter, checking for signs of whoever, or whatever, had been outside. The footprints were gone, but other signs were not. Broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, and the occasional faint echo of movement in the distance. As night fell again, I made sure the fire was strong and the lanterns were ready. Every small noise now had a weight, a meaning. It was no longer just the forest sounds I had heard the first night. There were patterns, rhythms, something deliberate. And then I realized the firelight was drawing them closer. The same sounds, footsteps, soft thuds against the walls, something scraping against the wood, were closer to the cabin than before. My stomach churned. I couldn't tell if they were watching, testing me, or just moving through. At some point, the noises stopped. Complete silence fell. My muscles were tight, my body exhausted from fear and tension. I couldn't sleep, but I tried to rest. The morning revealed nothing new outside, no signs of forced entry, nothing but the quiet forest and the distant sound of the creek. I began to accept that maybe it had just been a transient hiker, someone passing through, but a gnawing sense of unease remained. The following days were spent in a delicate routine. I ventured out only briefly to collect firewood and check the perimeter, keeping my eyes and ears alert for any anomaly. Every shadow felt larger, every sound more purposeful. I found old animal tracks, raccoons, maybe a deer or two, but no human footprints since the first day. I began rationing food, knowing that I had to be careful if I had to spend more nights alone. Then, on the third night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, whipping branches against the roof, rattling windows. Rain pelted the cabin, drumming on the roof in an uneven, chaotic rhythm. The fire struggled, and I had to tend it constantly. Somewhere in the darkness outside, I thought I could hear the unmistakable sound of someone moving against the trees, close, testing the storm for cover. I stayed by the fire, the axe in hand, every sense sharpened to a painful edge. Hours passed. The storm raged, and the forest outside became almost unrecognizable. I could barely see beyond a few feet. And then, when the wind was at its strongest, I thought I heard the soft, deliberate scraping of something along the side of the cabin. Something heavy, something with intention. Morning brought clarity. The side of the cabin had deep scratches in the wood, gouged into the siding, as if someone had tried to force their way in or at least leave a message. My stomach lurched. I realized that the first tracks I had seen weren't random. They belonged to someone who had been watching, possibly following me from the moment I arrived. I could no longer convince myself it was a coincidence. I decided then that I couldn't stay any longer. I packed quickly, moving quietly to avoid making any sound that could give away my position. I double-checked the doors and windows, but there was no time to secure everything perfectly. My sedan was half a mile down the gravel path, and every step toward it felt like a countdown. The forest seemed alive, oppressive, and close. My heart was in my throat, my muscles coiled like springs ready to burst. When I reached the car, I nearly dropped the keys in my haste. I threw everything inside, locking doors behind me. I sat for a moment listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No scraping. Only the wind and rain, the storm beginning to calm slightly. I started the engine and drove slowly down the overgrown path, every few seconds glancing at the tree-line for signs of movement. The drive back to civilization took hours. I had been planning this trip for months, ever since I found a small cabin listed online, tucked deep into the mountains of northern Idaho. The pictures were rustic but solid, thick logs, a stone fireplace, a small porch that looked over a stretch of forest. It promised silence, isolation, and a break from everything in my daily life. I had always liked the idea of being alone, with nothing but my own thoughts and the wilderness around me, though I had never gone this far before. Usually, my trips were short hikes or camping in the backcountry, but this was different. I would be entirely on my own, with no neighbors for miles and no cell signal once I got up the mountain. That was part of the appeal. The drive to the cabin took most of the day. I left my apartment early, stopping only for gas and a sandwich, and by the time I turned off the main road onto a narrow gravel path, the sun was already low in the sky. The road wound up the mountainside, tight turns surrounded by thick pine trees, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. The air smelled fresher here, damp and earthy, a mixture of pine and cold soil. I kept telling myself it was exciting, that it was part of the adventure, but a small part of my brain kept noticing how quiet it was. No cars, no birds, barely any wind. Just silence, heavy and full. When I finally arrived at the cabin, it was almost dark. The structure looked exactly as it had in the pictures, sturdy and unpretentious, though even in the fading light, I could see that the wood had darkened with age. The porch creaked under my boots as I stepped down from my car, and the first thing I noticed was how cold it was, despite it being mid-October. I carried my bags inside, set them down in the small entryway, and ran my hands over the furniture. Everything was simple but well cared for. A wooden table, a few chairs, a couch, and the fireplace dominating one wall. I unpacked slowly, methodically. I had brought food, a small stove, firewood, and a lantern in case the electricity went out. There was no phone signal, just as I had expected, so I told myself it didn't matter. I could hear the faint drip of water somewhere in the kitchen sink and the soft whistle of wind through the small gaps in the cabin's logs. I lit a fire, and as the flames crackled, I felt a moment of satisfaction, a warm relief that spread through my chest. The fire was small at first but grew, the room glowing golden, shadows dancing along the walls. I ate a simple meal, then washed the dishes in the cold water, noticing how different it felt to be responsible for everything in the cabin, even the smallest tasks. Outside, night fell completely, and I realized I could see the stars clearly between the trees. It was beautiful, unsettling in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I kept telling myself I was fine, but there was a weight in the silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The first night was restless. I lay awake for hours, listening to the wind brushing against the cabin, the occasional rustle in the underbrush. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. I sat up and strained to see, but the darkness pressed in through the windows. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or maybe a bear, though I knew bears were usually not active at this hour. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep on the thin mattress, waking in the early morning to the dim light filtering through the curtains. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I had brought hiking boots and a small backpack, just enough to carry water, some snacks, and a first aid kit. The trail started behind the cabin and wound through dense forest, muddy in places from recent rain. I walked carefully, trying to keep track of landmarks, though everything looked the same. Tall trees, thick underbrush, fallen logs. Birds called occasionally, but mostly it was the sound of my own steps and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. By midday, I had reached a clearing overlooking a small creek. I sat on a rock and took off my backpack, drinking some water and watching the sun glint off the rippling surface. The creek was shallow but fast, winding its way through rocks and fallen branches. I thought about fishing, but I had forgotten to bring anything other than my small snack bars. After a while, I decided to head back, but I realized I had lost track of the trail. The forest looked different from this angle, and the sun had moved enough that shadows were longer and darker. I tried retracing my steps, but nothing looked familiar. Panic started to creep in. I told myself to stay calm, to think logically. I checked the direction of the sun and tried to orient myself back toward the cabin. Each step felt heavier, the forest darker, more suffocating. Then I heard it. A low, steady sound, almost like a groan, coming from deeper in the trees. I froze, trying to determine the source. Stopped, then started again, closer this time. My heart pounded, and I knew I had to move, but every direction looked the same. I started walking, faster this time, following the faint trail I thought I had come from. The sound followed me, but I couldn't tell if it was real or my imagination. The trees seemed to close in, their shadows stretching across the ground like fingers. I tripped over a root and fell, scraping my hands and knees. Pain surged through me, but I scrambled up, ignoring it, pushing forward. Eventually, after what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, I saw the faint outline of the cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me so intensely I almost cried. I ran the last few meters, throwing myself inside, slamming the door behind me. I locked it, even though I knew it probably didn't matter, and sat on the couch, breathing heavily. The fire was still burning from the night before, though the logs were mostly ash now. I thought about what I had heard, the groaning sound. It had been too deliberate, too slow to be a deer or any normal animal. My mind ran through every possibility, bear, human, something else, but there was no clear answer. I spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the windows and doors as best I could, using chairs and anything heavy I could find. I didn't hear the sound again that day, but the tension remained, like a tight coil in my chest. The following morning, I forced myself to check outside. I needed water, food, and firewood, and staying cooped up was impossible. I took a careful walk around the cabin, noting the area and checking for anything unusual. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint in the dirt and mud near the side of the cabin, larger than mine and oddly human-shaped, though the spacing was wrong for a normal stride. My stomach sank. They led from the edge of the forest directly to the porch, stopped for a moment, then returned toward the trees. I didn't panic at first. I examined the prints carefully, looking for a pattern, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was another hiker, maybe someone checking on the cabin, but nothing had indicated anyone else had been in the area. I started taking notes, mapping the prints, but the unease never left me. I decided to stay inside for the rest of the day, chopping firewood through the window and keeping a constant watch. By the second night, I was prepared differently. I had barricaded the door, stacked heavy furniture near the windows, and kept a small axe and a knife within reach. I barely slept, listening to every noise, every rustle. Around midnight, the sound returned, the slow groaning that had followed me the day before. This time it wasn't distant, it was just outside. I could hear the soft crunch of dirt, faint breathing, and the shifting of something large moving across the ground. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe, until the sound finally faded, leaving an almost unbearable silence behind. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in fear anymore. I needed a plan to leave, but the road down the mountain was steep, and my car was parked far away. I packed supplies, taking extra water and food, and set out cautiously. I kept an eye on every shadow, every movement, and though the forest seemed calm during the day, I could feel that same tension, the sense of being watched. The trail was treacherous, roots and rocks threatening every step, but I made steady progress. Around mid-afternoon, I saw movement in the trees ahead. A man stepped onto the path, his clothes dirty, eyes darting, holding a long stick. He froze when he saw me, then took a step back. I stopped as well, weighing options. The man didn't move aggressively, but there was something raw and unpredictable in his posture, like he had lived in the forest longer than he should have. Slowly, I continued walking, maintaining distance. He didn't follow. I realized then that I had been lucky. Whatever had been near the cabin, whatever had left the footprints, it wasn't going to chase me today. By the time I reached the car, the sun was low. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove down the mountain, the gravel path rattling the car, my hands still trembling. I didn't look back even once. By the time I hit the main road, the forest I had planned the trip for months, checking maps and reading reviews, thinking I had covered every angle. I wanted a cabin in the middle of nowhere, away from the noise and the people. I wanted to see the forest in its raw state, untouched, and I wanted to be completely alone. The cabin itself was old, wooden, but sturdy. From the photos online, it looked like it had been well maintained, even if it had been built decades ago. It was on the edge of a thick forest, with a small, overgrown path leading from the main dirt road. The GPS signal vanished about a mile out, and I had printed directions, but even then, I had to rely on the rough outline in my memory to find the last turn. The air smelled of wet pine and soil, and when I parked my car in front of the cabin, I felt that strange mixture of excitement and unease that always comes when stepping somewhere completely unknown. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not the kind of quiet you hear when you close a window in the city, but a real, deep quiet where you can hear the faintest things if you pay attention. Leaves moved slightly with the wind, birds called somewhere far off, and the occasional snap of a twig under some small animal's weight reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. But the stillness pressed on me. I carried my backpack with supplies inside, including a small stockpile of food, water, and extra blankets. I opened the cabin door. It creaked under my hand, the sound startling in the silent woods. The inside smelled faintly of damp wood and dust, but nothing was rotten. The floor was made of thick planks, worn smooth over years, and the windows had thick curtains that blocked most of the sunlight. The small kitchen had basic tools, a wood-burning stove, and some shelves with jars that were either empty or filled with old spices. I didn't plan on cooking much, but I liked having the option. I dropped my pack near the entrance and walked through the cabin, noticing the living area. A small couch covered in a faded, scratchy fabric, and a few chairs around a wooden table. There were a couple of books on a shelf, mostly old nature guides and some worn novels. I opened a window and felt the fresh air sweep inside, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The wind made the trees move in strange ways, shadows flitting across the walls. I shook off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just my imagination. I had been camping before, hiking in forests alone, and I knew the mind could play tricks when you are in silence for too long. I spent the afternoon unpacking my things, putting food in the small fridge, stacking firewood neatly near the stove, and setting up a small corner for sleeping. The bed was a simple mattress on a wooden frame, with a thick quilt that smelled faintly of mothballs. By the time I finished, the sun was lowering behind the trees, turning the forest into a golden blur. I decided to go outside and explore a little, mapping out the immediate area. The forest floor was uneven, thick with fallen leaves and needles. I followed a small stream that ran not far from the cabin, water trickling over rocks, creating little pockets of light where the sun hit it. I noticed the tracks of animals, maybe deer, foxes, and even raccoons. Every so often, the forest seemed to hold its breath, the sound of the water and the wind cutting through everything else. I felt a strange thrill walking among the trees, seeing things that felt untouched by humans for miles. When I returned to the cabin, the sky had turned a deep orange and red, and shadows began to stretch across the forest. I lit the stove and made a simple dinner, the fire warming the small space. I sat on the edge of the bed, eating slowly, listening to the wind outside. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds settling in for the night. That first night, sleep came slowly. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the windows, felt louder than usual. I told myself again that it was normal, that the cabin was old, that the forest was alive. Eventually, the weight of exhaustion overcame the tension, and I fell asleep, half conscious of the wind and shadows. Morning came cold. The sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, painting faint patterns on the wooden floor. I dressed in layers and stepped outside, the air crisp and smelling of wet pine. I decided to hike deeper into the woods. I had brought a small backpack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I wanted to get a sense of the surrounding area before it got too dark. I followed the stream upstream, climbing over rocks and fallen logs, the forest growing thicker with every step. Birds flew overhead, and the occasional deer bounded through the trees, stopping only to stare at me briefly before disappearing. The forest was beautiful, and for a while I felt at peace. But there was also that underlying sense of isolation, a realization that if something went wrong, help would be far away. I didn't notice the time passing until the sun began to sink again. I turned back toward the cabin, trying to remember the path I had taken. But the forest had a way of changing perspective. Trees that seemed far apart now looked close together. Familiar landmarks appeared different from another angle. I walked quickly, trying to retrace my steps. Then I noticed a patch of disturbed earth, fresh and loose, not a normal animal trail. My stomach tightened. I slowed, scanning the area. There were more tracks, footprints unlike anything I had expected. They were too large for a person wearing normal shoes, but too small to be any large wild animal I knew. They followed a path that led roughly in the direction of the cabin. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. My first thought was that it was some sort of local trespasser, maybe a hunter or someone who had stumbled on the cabin like I had. I considered going back quickly, but I wanted to be careful. If there was someone following me, I didn't want to panic. I kept moving, watching for more signs, every step sounding louder in the quiet forest. When I finally glimpsed the cabin through the trees, I froze. There were fresh footprints in the dirt near the entrance, muddy, as though someone had been there recently. Not just anyone. Someone had opened the door. The thought of someone inside, moving around my cabin, made my chest tighten. I circled slowly, looking for any sign of entry, any clue of what had happened. I noticed a set of marks on the wooden door, where it had been scraped slightly. My heart raced. I went to the nearest window, looking inside, but the curtains blocked most of the view. The stove was cold, my belongings untouched as far as I could tell, but the sense of intrusion was there, heavy and pressing. I went around to the back, checking for another point of entry. Everything seemed intact, but the forest made it hard to see clearly. Shadows played tricks on my eyes, branches bending in the wind, creating shapes that weren't really there. I knew I needed to do something before it got dark again. I packed my backpack quickly, grabbing only essentials: water, food, the first aid kit, and the flashlight. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin if someone else had found their way here. I needed to get to a safer place, somewhere visible to others, somewhere I could find help if I needed it. I began hiking toward the main dirt road, trying to keep calm. The path was rough, overgrown in places, but I remembered parts of it from my arrival. I kept my ears open for any unusual sound: branches snapping too sharply, rustling that didn't match the wind. Every sound made me flinch, my pulse quickening. Hours passed as I moved cautiously, using the sun's position to guide me. I stopped occasionally to rest, crouching behind trees or rocks, scanning the area. The deeper I went, the more I realized how isolated I truly was. No houses, no lights, nothing but the forest stretching in all directions. I felt both small and exposed, aware of every possible danger. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing with a makeshift dirt road. Relief washed over me. I could see tire tracks faintly pressed into the earth. I decided to follow them, hoping they would lead somewhere inhabited. The road twisted through the forest, rising and falling, sometimes obscured by fallen leaves. My legs ached, my back strained under the backpack, but I kept moving. I knew that if I stayed in the cabin, I might run into whoever had been there, and that thought was unbearable. Eventually, the road led me to a larger path, where I could see signs of human activity: a fence post, some markers, and the distant sound of engines. I moved toward the noise, waving my arms in case someone saw me. Soon, I reached a small town on the edge of the forest. Exhausted and shaken, I found the local authorities and told them what had happened, showing them the location of the cabin and the tracks I had seen. They were concerned and promised to check the area. I stayed in the town for the night, feeling safer than I had in days. Weeks later, I learned that the cabin had been broken into by a small gang of thieves who had been using abandoned cabins in the forest as temporary hideouts. They had left before the authorities arrived, but they were eventually caught. I returned to the cabin only once after that, accompanied by local law enforcement. Everything was as I had left it, but the sense of peace was. I drove for hours through winding back roads that I barely recognized, following the directions to a cabin deep in the woods that I had rented online. The GPS lost signal a long time ago, and now I relied only on a small printed map that was already smudged from the condensation in my car. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the trees, and there was a chill in the air that hinted at the coming night. The road was rough, a mixture of dirt and scattered gravel, and it felt like I was leaving the world I knew far behind. The trees grew taller and closer together, their branches forming an arch over the path, so that light barely reached the ground. I could feel the isolation already, a quiet that was almost too deep, and I knew I wouldn't see anyone else until I left this forest, which was comforting and unnerving at the same time. Finally, after what seemed like forever, I reached a small clearing. The cabin stood there, made of weathered logs, with a roof that had seen better days and windows that reflected the fading light. It looked solid, though, and there was a sense of permanence to it, like it had been here for decades, surviving storms and winters that must have been harsh. I parked my car beside the cabin and stepped out, stretching my stiff legs. The air was cold and smelled of pine and wet earth. I could hear nothing but the wind brushing through the leaves and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the distance. No birds, no animals, just silence. The first thing I noticed when I got closer was the door. It had scratches near the bottom, probably from years of wear, and the lock looked old. I unlocked it, half expecting it to be stuck, and pushed it open. The inside smelled like wood and dust, There was a main room with a small fireplace, an old wooden table with chairs, and a staircase leading to a loft above. Everything was functional but simple. I set my backpack down and walked around, checking the windows, the kitchen area, and the loft. There were a few basic supplies left for guests: a bundle of firewood, some matches, and a box of canned food. I took a deep breath and told myself this would be a peaceful weekend. Just me, the cabin, and the forest. By the time I had settled in, the sun had disappeared, leaving only the dim glow of dusk. I lit a fire in the fireplace, the flames licking the walls and casting long shadows that danced across the wooden surfaces. The heat was comforting, and for a while I felt safe. I cooked a simple meal and sat quietly, staring at the fire, listening to the wind. Night in the forest was different. It was not just dark. It was deep, almost physical. Every sound, every movement seemed amplified. I could hear branches brushing against the cabin, leaves rustling, and occasionally a distant animal cry that made my heart skip. But I was rational. These were normal sounds in the woods. Still, I couldn't shake a vague feeling of being watched. I decided to explore a bit before sleeping. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The night was complete around me. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and my light barely reached beyond the first few trees. I walked slowly, careful not to trip over roots or rocks. The forest seemed endless, the trees repeating themselves in endless rows, and I realized just how isolated I was. There was a creek not far from the cabin, and the sound of running water was oddly soothing. I followed it for a while, enjoying the sound, until I noticed something strange. On the ground near the creek, there were footprints. They were large, not human, and fresh, pressed into the soft earth. I froze. For a moment, I debated whether to follow them or run back. My rational mind told me it could be a bear, or maybe even a large deer, but the size was unsettling. I retraced my steps quickly back to the cabin, telling myself it was nothing, just a deer. But the unease stayed with me. That night, sleep was difficult. I kept imagining the footprints, hearing noises in the dark that weren't really there. The wind seemed louder, the shadows longer. Every creak of the cabin made me tense. I kept the fire burning low, and at one point I got up to check the door, convinced I had heard someone or something outside. The door was closed, the lock intact. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been near the cabin, watching. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep, one eye half open, listening. Morning brought relief. Sunlight filtered through the trees, warming the cabin and making the shadows retreat. I stepped outside and looked around carefully. No footprints, no sign of anything unusual. Just the forest, quiet and serene. I went for a short walk, sticking close to the cabin, and tried to shake the memory of last night. The forest felt different in daylight. The isolation was still there, but the fear was manageable. I collected firewood, checked the surrounding area, and even started a small journal, writing down the layout of the cabin and my thoughts, a sort of grounding exercise. By the second day, I began to settle into a routine. I explored further, moving along the creek and finding a small clearing where the sunlight hit the ground in golden patches. Birds had returned, their songs filling the air. I found wild berries and even spotted a deer grazing a distance away. I felt a sense of connection to the forest, the kind that comes from being alone with nature for extended periods. But even in the daylight, there were moments that made me tense. Sudden rustlings in the undergrowth, the sense that I was being observed. I reminded myself that animals lived here, that humans rarely ventured into this part of the woods, and that my imagination could easily make normal things frightening. That night, however, something happened that made me understand just how quickly isolation could turn frightening. I had gone to bed early, after another day of walking and collecting firewood. The wind had picked up, rattling the cabin, and I could hear the branches tapping against the roof. I was just drifting off when I heard a sound that froze me instantly. A low, steady crunching around the perimeter of the cabin, outside. It wasn't wind. It wasn't falling branches. It was deliberate, slow moving. My stomach tightened. I stayed still, straining to listen. Whatever it was circling the cabin. Then I heard another sound, a soft thump against one of the windows. I held my breath, convinced I was imagining it. Then another thump. This time I could not ignore it. My heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding me. I grabbed the baseball bat I had brought, ready to defend myself, and cautiously moved toward the window. My flashlight was on the floor beside the bed. I picked it up, trying to see anything outside. Nothing, just darkness. The trees, the shadows. Silence, apart from the faint crackle of the fire behind me. I told myself again it was probably an animal, maybe a bear or something else, but the deliberate thumps didn't match any animal behavior I knew. Something didn't feel right. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, moving the flashlight around every corner of the cabin, checking the windows, listening to every sound. The wind died down around 3 a.m., and the noises stopped as suddenly as they began. The relief was almost overwhelming, but exhaustion was already taking its toll. I slept fitfully until morning, waking at the first light. When I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints, large with heavy treads, circling the cabin from all sides. They were fresh, pressed into the damp earth, and they confirmed what my mind had feared the night before. Someone had been here watching. My stomach sank. I walked around the cabin slowly, noting the prints, checking that nothing was broken or stolen. Everything was intact. Whoever had done this had not entered, or at least had not taken anything. But the sense of violation, the knowledge that I had been observed, was hard to shake. I spent the day preparing. I reinforced the doors and windows as best as I could with whatever I had. Sticks jammed in the locks, furniture blocking access, firewood piled strategically. I decided I wouldn't explore far from the cabin again until I left. I stayed alert, every sound making me tense. The forest felt alive in a way that was no longer comforting, and I couldn't ignore the vulnerability I felt. That night, I kept the fire blazing and stayed awake, listening. Hours passed with no disturbance. I managed small stretches of sleep, always waking at every sound. The fear was exhausting. On the third morning, I made a decision. I would leave. The rental period was technically not over, but my sense of safety outweighed any obligation. I packed methodically, keeping the car keys and essentials on me. Before leaving, I took one last careful walk around the cabin. There were no new footprints, no disturbances. I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Part of me wanted to understand who had been here, why, but rationality told me it wasn't worth the risk. I locked the cabin as best as I could, leaving notes for the owner about the state of the place, and walked back to my car. Driving out of the forest was slow. The dirt road seemed longer than before. I never thought a short trip to the cabin in the woods could become the kind of experience that would stay with me for years. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, a chance to get away from the constant noise and stress of the city. I wanted silence, fresh air, and the feeling of being completely isolated. The cabin I rented was small, wooden, and slightly weathered, tucked into a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. The GPS signal had dropped about 10 minutes from the cabin, and from there I drove carefully on a rough, gravel path that twisted between dense forest and low hills. The last stretch was steep, and the old truck I borrowed groaned under the incline, tires sliding slightly over loose stones. I arrived just before sunset. The sky was a clear orange, fading into pale purple, and the air smelled faintly of damp soil and pine needles. The cabin looked exactly like the photos online, rustic but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a small porch that had some moss growing on the railing. I parked the truck beside the cabin and unloaded my gear. It wasn't much, just a backpack with clothes, a cooler with food, and some basic supplies. The first thing I noticed as I stepped onto the porch was how quiet it was. There was no wind, no birds, no insects buzzing. Even the rustling of leaves seemed absent. The silence pressed on me in a way that made my chest feel tight, almost heavy. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. It was obvious that no one had stayed there in a while. I opened the windows to air it out and started unpacking. Inside, the furniture was minimal. A table with 2 chairs, a small couch, a bed with a thin mattress, and a wood stove. The kitchen was simple, with a sink, a small fridge, and a few pots and pans. I stacked my things on the counter and pulled firewood from the small pile near the door. I wanted to get a fire going before dark. By the time I had it started, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving only a deepening shade of blue in the sky. Shadows from the trees stretched across the clearing, long and dark. Night fell fast, much faster than I expected. The temperature dropped sharply, and I realized I had underestimated how cold it would get in the woods. I added more wood to the stove, and the flames flickered across the walls, casting dancing shadows. I sat on the couch and listened to the quiet. At first, it felt peaceful, but soon the silence started to feel oppressive. Every small noise, the crack of a branch outside, the creak of the floorboards, sounded louder than it should. The hairs on my arms prickled. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a small animal moving around outside. Around midnight, the first real unease hit me. I heard it clearly, a soft, deliberate sound, like something scraping against the wooden wall outside. My stomach tightened. I froze, listening. The sound came again, slightly longer this time, slow and steady. I tried to convince myself it was just the trees shifting or maybe a raccoon on the porch, but the timing felt too deliberate, too careful. It wasn't random. It repeated once more, then stopped. I held my breath and strained my ears. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound, real or imagined, made me jump. The thought of being completely alone in a remote cabin made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I went outside to explore a bit. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by forest, and the trees were tall and densely packed. The ground was damp with morning dew, and small patches of fog hung low, curling around the trunks. I walked a short distance, just enough to see that the forest went on for miles in every direction. The isolation was total. There were no nearby houses, no roads visible beyond the gravel path I drove in on. It was beautiful, but the beauty had an edge, a sense of something lurking beyond the visual calm. I found footprints in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. Small, maybe an animal, but I couldn't be sure. They disappeared into the trees. I felt a subtle prickling at the back of my neck and reminded myself to stay calm. I spent the day chopping more wood, cleaning the cabin, and organizing my food supplies. I made a simple lunch on the stove and tried to enjoy the quiet. But even with daylight, the sense of unease didn't fully go away. It was like the forest itself was watching. Every bird call or rustle in the bushes made me tense up. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, this was exactly what I came here for. Solitude, quiet, and a break from the chaos of city life. Late in the afternoon, while preparing a simple dinner, I heard it again, the sound of scraping, slow and deliberate, outside the cabin. My heart jumped, and I froze. This time, I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door cautiously. The porch was empty. No footprints, no movement. I shone the light across the clearing. The beam cut through the dim light of dusk, revealing nothing but trees and undergrowth. I scanned slowly, making sure I didn't miss anything. There was no one, nothing. I exhaled, a slow, relieved breath, convincing myself it was my imagination, that maybe some branches or rocks had caused the noise. I locked the doors and windows, double-checked them, and decided to stay inside until morning. The fire in the stove made the room warm, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I slept even less than the first. Every creak, every snapping twig outside made my pulse spike. By sunrise, I was exhausted, and my nerves were raw. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. During the day, I would convince myself that nothing was wrong, that the cabin and the forest were harmless. But at night, the noises returned. Scraping, dragging, soft thumps, all just outside the walls of the cabin. Sometimes it felt like something circled the clearing. I checked the doors and windows constantly, but never found signs of anyone being there. I even set up a small line of stones and sticks around the perimeter as a kind of early warning system. Anyone or anything moving through would knock something over, but by morning, the sticks were undisturbed. The stress began to wear on me. Simple tasks became difficult. Eating, cleaning, chopping wood. All took much longer because I kept expecting something to happen. I began sleeping in shifts, dozing by the fire, staying half awake, flashlight in hand. My mind was constantly racing. I knew logically that the forest was mostly empty of humans, but my instincts screamed that I was not alone. I couldn't tell if it was fear magnifying ordinary sounds, or if there really was something out there. By the fifth night, I decided to stay fully awake, pacing the cabin, holding the flashlight, listening to every sound. The fire burned low, leaving patches of darkness in the corners. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Soft, deliberate scraping at the side wall. I pressed my back against the door, heart hammering. The sound moved slowly, almost methodically, circling part of the cabin. I realized then that this was no random animal. The noise stopped suddenly, and the silence returned. My chest tightened. I could hear my own breathing echoing in the cabin. Suddenly, a shadow appeared at the window nearest the porch. I froze. It was a human shape crouched still, watching. My mind went blank with fear. I grabbed the heavy cast iron pan from the stove and approached the window slowly, careful not to make any noise. The shadow moved slightly and then disappeared into the darkness. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get to the truck, to leave immediately. I grabbed my backpack, threw my essentials inside, and prepared to escape. Before I opened the door, I paused and listened. Silence. The forest seemed impossibly still. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the clearing. The truck was exactly where I left it, the path clear. No one visible, not even a faint movement. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The truck roared to life, echoing through the silent forest. I drove carefully down the gravel path, constantly glancing into the trees, expecting someone to step out. Nothing happened. The path eventually met the main road, and I sped away without looking back. When I finally reached the nearest town, I parked and sat in the truck for a long time, letting my hands relax and my pulse slow. I called the local authorities to report suspicious activity near the cabin, but with no evidence, there was little they could do. They advised me to stay away until they could investigate. In the following days, I realized how raw the experience had left me. The fear was physical, a constant tightness in my chest, and mental, a lingering feeling that the world was not as safe as I thought. I never returned to that cabin. I eventually sold the rental agreement and avoided any isolated cabins for years. But the story stayed with me. I knew now that the forest could be beautiful, silent, and deadly in ways that had nothing to do with ghosts or fantasy. Simply human danger, lurking, patient, unseen. The clarity of that fear. It started as a simple plan, one I had repeated to myself many times over in the days leading up to my trip. I wanted to be alone, away from everyone, away from the constant buzz of the city, away from responsibilities that never seemed to stop piling up. My mind had been restless for months, and when I stumbled across a small, isolated cabin listed online, hidden deep in the woods of a state park, it seemed perfect. The description was simple: a rustic cabin, wood interior, small porch, no electricity, no running water, and a nearby creek. It was exactly what I wanted. The isolation called to me. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon, the sun low and golden behind the thick trunks of pine and oak. The drive had been long, winding along narrow roads that barely fit my car, flanked on either side by dense trees. The forest seemed silent in a way that felt unnatural at first, but I quickly found it comforting. Birds occasionally called out, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush was constant but subtle. When I finally turned onto a dirt path marked only by a weathered wooden sign with the cabin's name, I felt a small rush of excitement mixed with unease. The path was narrow and uneven, and I had to slow down to avoid large roots and potholes. The cabin appeared suddenly between the trees, small and simple, but well kept. The wood had weathered to a silver gray, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle, but it looked stable. There was a small porch with a single rocking chair that had clearly seen better days. A fire pit sat a few feet away, surrounded by stones, and the smell of the forest, damp and earthy, filled the air. I parked my car nearby and stepped out, stretching my legs. Immediately, the quiet hit me. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, that makes every small sound. The wind rustling through the leaves, a branch cracking, a bird taking flight, louder than it should be. I spent the first hour exploring the cabin. Inside, it was rustic but functional. A small kitchen area with a propane stove and a sink without running water. A table with 2 chairs, a few shelves with old, dusty pans and dishes. The walls were bare except for a single painting, a landscape of a river cutting through a forest much like the one surrounding me. The bedroom had a small bed with a thin mattress, a blanket folded at the foot, and a single lantern sitting on a shelf. A wood stove sat in the corner of the main room, with a stack of firewood next to it. Everything was simple, nothing unnecessary, and I liked it. I unpacked my things quickly, feeling the ease of solitude settle into my chest. The first night was quiet, peaceful even. I made a fire in the stove and watched the flames dance, the cabin glowing in the warm light. The wind whispered outside, but inside, I felt safe. I had packed enough food for 3 days, a cooler for perishable items, and my water supply. I had brought books, a notebook, and my camera. I intended to spend my time hiking, photographing the forest, writing, and generally existing without anyone else around. Sleep came easily, wrapped in the warmth of the fire. The next day, I hiked along a trail that ran parallel to a creek I had seen from the cabin porch. The water ran clear and cold, tumbling over rocks and forming small pools along the way. I walked for hours, exploring, taking pictures, making notes about the plants and animals I saw. It was exactly as I had imagined. Peaceful, almost idyllic. The forest was alive with the sound of water, wind, and distant wildlife. I returned to the cabin as the sun dipped below the trees, the light turning the forest gold and red. I made a simple dinner, ate by the fire, and went to bed again, satisfied. It was on the 3rd day that things began to feel off. I had spent the morning hiking, and when I returned, I noticed small things. The porch chair was slightly moved from where I had left it. A small branch lying across the path I had walked earlier that morning, though the wind had been calm. I shrugged it off as coincidence, the forest being what it is, constantly changing and moving. But as the day wore on, the feeling of being watched grew. I kept thinking I saw movement from the corner of my eye, small figures darting between trees, always gone when I looked directly. My mind tried to rationalize it, squirrels, birds, shadows, but the sense of unease persisted. By nightfall, the cabin felt smaller somehow, more confining. The silence of the forest pressed in against the walls. I decided to make an early fire, something to keep me grounded, and sat staring at the flames longer than usual. Every sound outside, wind, branches, distant animal cries, made me tense. At some point, I realized the fire had died down almost completely, leaving the room dim and cold. I added more wood, fed the flames, and watched them catch. The warmth was comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound at the door. My eyes snapped open, heart hammering. It was subtle at first, just a faint scratching. I froze, listening. Came again, slightly louder. Someone or something was at the door. I grabbed the largest knife I had brought from my kitchen supplies and moved cautiously toward the entrance. The sound stopped the moment I reached the door. I strained my ears, but the forest was silent again. I opened the door just a crack, peering out, but nothing was there. The night was dark, the trees casting heavy shadows in the moonlight. I told myself it was an animal, perhaps a raccoon or a deer scratching against the wood. My rational mind tried to calm the fear clawing at my chest, but I didn't sleep well the rest of the night, checking the windows and doors every half hour. The following morning, I explored closer to the cabin, inspecting the immediate surroundings. I found footprints near the back of the cabin, prints that didn't match my own. They were small, human, and fresh. Panic surged through me. Someone had been here while I was sleeping. My mind raced, considering every scenario. The cabin was supposed to be isolated. I hadn't passed anyone on the trail. I checked the locks, the doors, every window, and even looked through the trees to see if I could spot anyone. Nothing. I felt trapped, suddenly vulnerable in the isolation I had once craved. For the next day, I stayed inside, barricading the cabin as best as I could with furniture and making sure the doors were locked at all times. I barely ate, barely moved, constantly listening. Every small sound, a branch snapping, leaves rustling, made me flinch. I began to notice details I hadn't before. Marks on the trees near the cabin, small broken twigs, faint impressions in the dirt that weren't my own. Someone had been observing me for longer than I realized. The rational part of me tried to maintain calm, thinking perhaps a hiker had come close without realizing I was there. But the fear in my gut told me otherwise. The fourth night was unbearable. The sense of being watched was suffocating. I slept fitfully, waking every hour, convinced I could hear footsteps outside, whispers carried on the wind. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass across the window. I froze, knife in hand, breath shallow. I didn't move for what felt like hours, but eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, my hands shaking, heart racing. As I prepared to leave, I noticed the most terrifying detail yet. The back door had been forced slightly. The lock was scratched, the frame splintered. Someone had tried to get in while I slept, and I hadn't been aware until just now. My blood ran cold. I hurried down the path to my car, constantly scanning the trees for movement. Every rustle made me jump. Every shadow seemed to reach for me. The drive back was tense. Every noise on the road, every sudden flash of light or movement along the tree line made me flinch. I didn't stop until I reached the first town, where the lights and people gave me a strange comfort. I reported the incident to the park authorities, giving them every detail I could recall, and they promised to check the area, patrol the trails, and warn other visitors. When I finally returned home, the relief was overwhelming. I could breathe again, let go of the tension that had gripped me for days. I realized that isolation, while tempting, had a price. Being alone in a remote place leaves you exposed, not just to the elements, but to other humans who might take advantage of that solitude. Weeks later, I learned that the cabin had been targeted by a local group who would scout isolated cabins and break in when they thought no one was home. My cabin had been one of their marks, and I had narrowly avoided a dangerous confrontation. I felt lucky, more aware now of the vulnerability of isolation, but I also felt a strange sense of resolve. I had faced fear in its rawest, most human form and survived. I didn't return to that forest, not for years, but I carried with me a deep respect for the power of solitude and the potential danger of another human being. I never expected that my decision to spend a week alone in a remote cabin in the mountains would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I had been hiking and camping for years, always careful, always prepared, and yet nothing had prepared me for the combination of isolation, nature, and the slow, creeping sense of dread that took hold of me that week. The cabin was tucked deep into a forested area, miles from any road, with only a narrow, barely maintained trail leading to it. I had found it listed online, a rustic little place that promised solitude and a chance to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. At the time, it seemed perfect. The first day was uneventful, filled with the kind of small, satisfying tasks I always enjoyed when camping or hiking. I unloaded my pack and carried it into the cabin, noting the details that I would later wish I hadn't. The faint smell of mildew in the corners, the thin layer of dust on the shelves, the way the floor creaked under each step, almost as if the cabin itself was groaning under some invisible weight. I organized my supplies, stacked firewood near the stone fireplace, and set my sleeping bag on the worn bed. The walls were made of rough-hewn logs, and the small windows barely let in light, making the interior dim even during midday. I liked the quiet, the smell of pine from the surrounding forest, and the sound of a nearby creek flowing over rocks. That first night, I built a fire and settled into a routine I thought would make my stay comfortable. I cooked a simple meal, the smoke from the fireplace filling the room with a warm, comforting smell. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and the sound of animals, mostly deer and birds, echoed faintly. I felt completely alone, and in the beginning, that was exactly what I wanted. I read a little, checked my gear, and eventually fell asleep to the steady crackle of the fire. The second day, I explored the immediate surroundings of the cabin. The forest was thick, with towering pines and hardwoods forming an almost impenetrable canopy in some areas. I followed the creek upstream for a while, marveling at how secluded this place truly was. It felt like the world had stopped, that time itself was different here. I found some wild berries, though I was careful to avoid anything I couldn't positively identify. The sun shifted behind clouds, and a thin fog started rolling through the trees, turning the forest into something unfamiliar and strange, even though I had walked these woods for hours without incident. That night, I started hearing noises that I couldn't explain. At first, it was just faint rustling outside, which I assumed was a deer or other small animal. Then came a louder sound, something like a branch snapping under a heavy foot. My first instinct was to rationalize it. I was in the woods, anything could happen, animals move, wind breaks branches, but there was a subtle difference in the sound, the way it echoed near the cabin. It wasn't random, it felt deliberate. I went to the window, careful to keep my flashlight off, and peered out, but saw nothing. I convinced myself it was my imagination, a product of isolation and the eerie quiet, and eventually went to bed, though I left the fire burning longer than usual. By the third day, I had started to notice signs that someone or something had been near the cabin. Small things at first. Footprints in the mud that hadn't been there when I arrived. A branch that appeared snapped along the trail, and most unsettling, small rocks placed in a line near the door. I tried to rationalize everything. Animals could move rocks. Maybe someone had walked by earlier. Maybe the wind shifted the debris. But the pattern of the rocks didn't make sense for animals or random chance. My stomach sank with a sense of unease I couldn't shake. The fourth day was the breaking point. I had gone deeper into the forest, trying to occupy myself, when I realized I had left my trail markers behind. The forest suddenly felt different, oppressive, almost suffocating. I heard noises behind me that were impossible to identify. The snap of a branch, a faint rustle, the crunch of leaves. Every time I turned, there was nothing, but the sounds continued, almost following me. I moved faster, my heart pounding in my chest, and eventually found my way back to the cabin. When I arrived, I noticed that the firewood I had stacked neatly the day before was scattered across the yard. Nothing was missing, but the order had been destroyed. That realization hit me like a physical blow. Someone had been here, had come close to my cabin, and had left without confronting me directly. Sleep that night was impossible. I could hear every sound outside, the wind, the creek, the occasional rustle of a small animal, but my mind kept fixing on the possibility that it wasn't animals. I stayed awake until the fire died down, constantly checking the locks, the windows, every entry point. The cabin felt like a trap, small and exposed in a forest that suddenly seemed alive with unseen eyes. On the fifth day, I made a decision. I had to know whether someone was watching me, whether this was truly a human presence or just my mind amplifying the natural sounds of the forest. I spent the morning examining the perimeter, noting every footprint and mark in the mud, moving quietly to avoid detection. Then I set up rudimentary traps, tripwires with bells, small sticks arranged to make noise if stepped on. It felt foolish, almost paranoid, but the fear had grown too strong to ignore. That evening, my fear turned to outright terror. Around sunset, I heard movement outside, unmistakable this time. A figure, tall, moving slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. I froze, heart hammering. The figure paused, seemingly studying the cabin, before continuing its slow, deliberate circuit. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. I realized I had no weapon, No real way to defend myself if the person tried to force entry. My mind raced, calculating options. I could flee into the forest, but I would be completely exposed and disoriented. I could try to barricade myself inside, but the figure might simply wait it out. Hours passed. The figure eventually disappeared, but the feeling of dread remained. That night, I barely slept, dozing intermittently with one ear attuned to every sound outside. The forest had transformed into a place of potential danger, every rustle a threat, every shadow a potential intruder. By the 6th day, I had made a plan. I could not wait for help. I had no cell service, no nearby neighbors, no way to summon anyone quickly. I packed a small bag with essentials: food, water, a flashlight, my knife, and my lighter. I left the cabin cautiously, sticking to the edges of the forest, moving only in areas where I could see clearly and retreat if necessary. I stayed low, silent, hyper-aware of every sound. My body was tense, muscles coiled for action, adrenaline constantly surging. I followed a small stream, hoping it would lead me to a main trail or road. Hours passed with no sign of civilization. The forest seemed endless, and the fear of being followed never left me. Every time I stopped to rest, I could hear the faintest crunch behind me, the subtle snap of a branch, the whisper of something moving unseen. I forced myself to keep going, knowing that stopping would make me vulnerable. Eventually, as dusk approached, I stumbled upon a narrow dirt road. It was faint, overgrown in places, but unmistakably man-made. Relief surged through me. I followed it cautiously, scanning for any sign that someone had been tracking me. The road eventually led to a small ranger station. I was shaking, exhausted, and covered in mud and sweat, but I was safe. I explained my situation to the ranger, who called local authorities to check the area around the cabin. The investigation revealed signs of trespass: footprints, makeshift campsites nearby, and evidence that someone had been observing the cabin for days. There was no indication of their identity, but the authorities assured me that the area would be monitored more closely. They noted that in remote areas, isolated cabins could attract people with bad intentions, and that my vigilance likely prevented a dangerous confrontation. In the weeks that followed, I returned home and began the slow process of recovery. The fear, the sense of being hunted, remained for a while, but eventually I could sleep through the night again. I never returned to that cabin. Instead, I chose locations that were remote yet accessible, places where help was not hours away if something went wrong. The experience stayed with me, a reminder of how fragile the sense of safety can be when you are alone, even in a place as beautiful as the mountains. Looking back, I realized that the terror I felt was real, but it was also a product of awareness and preparation. I survived because I stayed alert, because I respected the potential danger of isolation, and because I made deliberate, careful decisions when faced with uncertainty. The cabin, the forest, the fear, they are all part of the memory now, a stark lesson in vigilance, self-reliance, and the thin line between solitude and exposure in the wild. Even now, months later, I find myself replaying the week over and over, recalling every detail. The creak of the floorboards, the smell of the forest. I had been driving through the mountains for hours, the sky above gradually darkening as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks. The road had narrowed to a single lane, cracked and lined with loose gravel that rattled under my tires. My car's headlights barely cut through the thickening mist that crept through the valleys. I had planned this trip to be a weekend retreat, a chance to disconnect from the constant noise of work and the city. I had rented a small cabin deep in the forest, a place that looked picturesque in the photos online, surrounded by towering pines and a frozen-looking creek that twisted through the land. But as I drove further from the nearest town, the photos began to feel like lies. Everything was darker, heavier, and colder than I had imagined. The GPS signal had faded a few miles back. I knew the road forked somewhere ahead, but the mist obscured any clear view of the turn. I slowed the car to a crawl, straining my eyes to spot the narrow trail that would take me to the cabin. The forest around me was silent except for the crunch of tires over gravel and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind passed through. I could see nothing beyond the reach of my headlights, but the weight of the darkness pressing in made me uneasy, as though I were being watched. The trees seemed unnaturally tall, their trunks twisted and gnarled, leaning toward the road like silent observers. I finally spotted the turn, a small, barely noticeable dirt trail that disappeared into thick undergrowth. I hesitated for a moment, trying to convince myself that this was normal, that the cabin would be there and everything would be fine. The tires slid over loose rocks and mud as I turned onto the trail. It felt as if I was driving into a tunnel of trees, the mist wrapping around the car in cold, damp fingers. The road narrowed even more, bordered by ditches and low-hanging branches that scraped against the roof. I had to slow down to a crawl to avoid hitting the larger rocks that jutted out of the mud. Every few seconds, I caught movement in the corner of my eye, something slipping between the trees, but when I focused on it, there was nothing, just the forest, still and silent. The cabin finally came into view as a shadow in the fog, a small wooden structure tucked into a clearing. It looked just like the photos, except colder, lonelier, and older than I had expected. The wood was darkened from years of weather, the roof sagging slightly in the middle, shingles missing in patches. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, though I hadn't noticed any sign of life. I parked the car, the tires sinking slightly into soft ground that smelled faintly of wet pine and decay. I could feel the chill settle into my bones immediately, a damp, biting cold that no coat seemed to fully block. The door was unlocked, which surprised me. I stepped inside, and the scent of damp wood and dust hit me immediately. The cabin had a small kitchen with a wood stove, a table with a few chairs, and a living area with a faded rug and a worn couch. There were several small bedrooms along a narrow hallway. I dropped my bag on the floor and turned on the small battery-powered lamp I had brought, illuminating the room with a soft, yellow glow. The shadows stretched across the walls, making the corners seem deeper and darker than they were. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and began setting up for the night. After unpacking, I decided to start a fire. The wood inside the cabin was dry, stacked neatly near the stove, and I could smell the faint resin of the pine as I laid the logs carefully. It took a few minutes to get a small flame going, and when it finally caught, the cabin began to warm. The crackling fire sounded reassuring in the otherwise oppressive silence. I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the soft hiss of burning wood and the occasional drip of condensation from the roof. Outside, the wind picked up, and the trees moaned softly in the night. Hours passed. I ate a small dinner I had brought along, the kind that didn't need cooking, and then I decided to check the creek nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, the mist curling around my legs as I walked down the narrow path to the water. The creek was partially frozen, with thin layers of ice forming along the edges. I could hear the faint rush of water beneath the ice, a whisper of movement that sounded louder in the silence. I shone my flashlight along the bank and saw nothing but rocks, frozen debris, and the occasional small animals scurrying back into the forest. I felt a strange tension in my chest, a sense of being too exposed, too small in a place where nature ruled completely. I turned back and hurried to the cabin, the darkness pressing closer with every step. When I returned, I tried to distract myself by reading and tidying up, but the unease didn't leave. I noticed small things, the floorboards creaking more than they should, a branch scratching against the window, the wind tapping in a pattern that felt almost deliberate. I told myself it was all normal, the house settling, the wind, nothing more. But my mind refused to settle. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted while I was outside, that the forest was watching, waiting, calculating. I went to bed early, telling myself a good night's sleep would fix everything. But I barely closed my eyes before I heard it. A sharp, quick knock on the outside door. My heart jumped into my throat. I froze, listening. Nothing. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my pulse. Another knock, louder this time, followed immediately by a low, dragging sound along the side of the cabin. My stomach tightened. Whoever or whatever was out there had to be close. I stayed on the bed, trying to control my breathing. I considered calling for help, but the phone signal was non-existent. I thought about grabbing the car keys and making a run for it, but the mud and narrow road made the idea of escaping dangerous. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, it was impossible to tell, and then silence. Absolute silence. The kind that presses against your ears and makes your own heartbeat seem loud enough to drown everything else. Exhausted, I eventually drifted into a restless sleep. I woke hours later to the sound of scratching inside the cabin. My eyes shot open, adjusting slowly to the dim light of early morning seeping through the windows. First, I thought I had imagined it. Then I saw the marks. Scratches along the side of the door frame, deep gouges in the wood that hadn't been there before. My stomach dropped. I checked the windows, the locks, every possible point of entry. Nothing was broken, no footprints outside in the wet soil, but the scratches were real, fresh, deliberate. My mind raced through possibilities. Animals? Perhaps, but the marks were too controlled, too purposeful. Human? Could be, but why would anyone be out here in this isolated place in the dead of night? I spent the rest of the morning securing every entrance I could, stacking furniture in front of doors, bolting windows, even wedging logs against the main door. Every noise outside made my heart leap. The wind, the trees, a distant bird. I couldn't tell anymore what was real and what my mind made up. I kept a large kitchen knife on me, and my flashlight was always in hand. I barely ate, barely slept, every sense on high alert. I realized I had underestimated the isolation. The beauty of the place had turned into a trap, the kind that seeps into your mind and convinces you that every shadow is a threat. By the second day, my anxiety had grown unbearable. I decided I had to leave. I waited for midday, when visibility would be best, and grabbed my keys and backpack. I opened the door slowly, scanning the surroundings. Everything seemed calm, deceptively so. I made my way back to the car, eyes darting between trees, listening for any hint of movement. The drive back down the mountain was tense. Every sound of gravel or branch scraping the car setting my nerves on edge. The forest seemed endless, oppressive, but gradually, the trees thinned, and the sun broke through the mist. I could finally see the fork in the road, and my heart lifted slightly. By the time I reached the first town, I was exhausted, my hands shaking from the adrenaline. I stopped at a small cafe, sitting for hours just trying to calm down. I realized the cabin had been beautiful, peaceful in photos, but the isolation and vulnerability it presented were terrifying. It wasn't ghosts or fantasy. It was real, the forest, the unknown, and the possibility of another person being near without you knowing it. That sense of powerlessness, of being completely exposed in a place where help was hours away, was enough to break down anyone's calm. I never returned to that cabin. I eventually found another cabin rental in a more populated area, one with neighbors nearby, where the forest didn't press in like a living entity, where I could leave if I felt unsafe. I kept the experience with me, a vivid reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't the supernatural. They are the real, tangible dangers of being utterly alone, in a place where even the most mundane things, wind, trees, darkness, can become terrifying. I learned to respect isolation, to never underestimate the wild, and to always have a plan to leave if something felt wrong. In the end, the experience I never thought a weekend getaway could turn into one of the most frightening experiences of my life. The cabin I rented was deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town, and I had imagined the peace it would bring. The drive there had been long, the winding dirt roads twisting between thick walls of pine trees, their branches leaning over the road like dark, silent sentinels. By the time I arrived, the sun was just dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the uneven path leading to the cabin. It looked rustic and solid from the outside, but as I parked my car, a chill ran down my spine that I could not explain. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, and it was darker than I had anticipated, the shadows inside the trees sharp and thick. I carried my bags to the cabin, my footsteps crunching against the gravel driveway. The front door was old and made of heavy wood, with a rusty lock that had clearly not been used in years. I struggled a bit before forcing it open, the hinges groaning loudly. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood, mixed with a faint moldy odor that made me wrinkle my nose. The space was small but cozy, a low wooden ceiling, bare light bulbs hanging from the center, and a stone fireplace that looked like it could have been useful once but was now empty. I set my bags down and walked through the small rooms, my shoes tapping softly on the creaking wooden floors. There were a few basic amenities: a small kitchen, a bedroom with a narrow bed, and a tiny bathroom. Nothing fancy, but enough for what I had planned, 3 days away from work, emails, and people. As night fell, I lit a small lantern I had brought, because the electricity seemed unreliable, flickering when I tested it. The forest outside had turned into a wall of black, the trees blending together into one enormous dark mass. I tried to relax, reminding myself that I had chosen this solitude. I cooked a simple meal over a portable stove and ate quietly in the dim light, listening to the forest, which was alive with sounds now. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, and an occasional animal cry. I knew I was far from any human presence, and I liked that. But there was an edge to the quiet, a tension I could not shake. It was not fear of ghosts or anything supernatural. It was the sheer isolation, the feeling of being watched, even if rationally I knew it was impossible. After dinner, I decided to walk around the cabin, letting the cool night air hit my face. The moon was partially visible, peeking through thick clouds, casting a pale, uneven glow over the forest. Each step on the ground felt heavier than the last, my imagination filling the darkness with shapes that were not there. I passed by a narrow trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the forest. Curiosity drew me forward. The trail was overgrown, and the underbrush scratched at my legs. I moved cautiously, my flashlight beam swinging across tree trunks and fallen logs. Suddenly, I heard it, a distant cracking sound, like a branch breaking. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound repeated, closer this time. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other forest animal, but the feeling of being observed was intensifying. I returned to the cabin and locked the doors, double-checking the windows. My mind raced with every possible scenario. I tried to rationalize it. There were bears in these forests, perhaps a coyote, or maybe just an overly curious raccoon. Still, I could not shake the sense that someone or something was out there. I slept poorly that night, waking every hour to the smallest noises, listening for anything unusual. The wind shook the cabin slightly, and the wooden floorboards creaked as if adjusting to the night's cold. I found myself gripping the edge of the bed, tension crawling through my shoulders, knowing I had to face another day in the same environment. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin more thoroughly. The daylight made the forest feel less menacing, but the dense trees still created a labyrinthine feeling. I hiked along narrow paths, stepping carefully over exposed roots and damp leaves. I noticed things I had missed the night before: the remnants of old campsites, broken branches that suggested large animals passed through, and shallow depressions in the earth that looked like they could be footprints. Most of all, I noticed how silent the forest really was, the usual bird sounds muted, the wind oddly consistent. By afternoon, I returned to the cabin, exhausted, and spent time cleaning up, preparing for the night. I double-checked that I had enough food and water and that my lanterns and candles were ready. The isolation was becoming tangible, a weight that settled over me. On the second night, the fear grew stronger. Around 11 p.m., I was woken by a sound at the window, a faint, rhythmic tapping. My heart raced, and I froze in bed, straining my ears. I told myself it could be a branch, the wind, anything. I stayed silent, listening. The tapping continued intermittently, then stopped. I stayed awake, listening to the forest for hours. At one point, I saw shadows moving outside the window, though it was impossible to tell if it was an animal or just the wind distorting shapes. I considered leaving, driving back to town, but the roads were treacherous in the dark, and I wanted to finish my weekend as planned. I knew I had to stay calm, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being observed. I spent the remainder of the night sitting by the lantern, eyes fixed on the window, my senses sharpened to the smallest movement or sound. The next day, I tried to distract myself by hiking deeper into the forest. I followed a narrow stream, noting the tracks along the mud, deer, raccoon, and one set that puzzled me. They were too large for a raccoon, too small for a deer, and the strides seemed irregular. I traced them for a while, but they vanished into the underbrush. I felt uneasy, but I reminded myself that it was common for hikers and hunters to be in these areas. Still, I made mental notes to be cautious, paying attention to the direction of the tracks relative to my cabin. Returning to the cabin, I reinforced my doors and windows with anything I could use as barriers: chairs, a broom, the heavy firewood stacked near the fireplace. It was a nervous precaution, but it helped me feel slightly safer. That night was the worst. Around 2 a.m., I heard noises outside, heavy footfalls on the gravel driveway. I stayed absolutely still, barely breathing, as the steps approached, stopped, and circled the cabin. My mind raced with possibilities, all frightening. Someone could be lost, or it could be someone with ill intent. I did not dare open the door or look outside. I stayed in my bedroom, listening as the sounds moved around, scraping the walls and even touching the windows lightly, testing their strength. Hours passed, and the intruder seemed to leave. By dawn, I was completely exhausted, my body tense, adrenaline coursing through me, and my mind exhausted from fear and vigilance. I knew I could not stay another night without risking something worse. The solitude I had sought now felt like imprisonment. At first light, I packed my belongings quickly, making sure everything was secure in my car. Before leaving, I made a thorough check of the cabin. There were footprints outside, heavy, boot-like impressions in the soft earth around the perimeter. Some marks suggested someone had tried the windows, pushing against them to see if they were locked. My stomach turned, a mix of relief and fear. I had survived, but I knew it could have gone badly. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. The forest receded slowly as I drove back toward the main road, sunlight washing over the trees, and with each mile, my sense of relief grew. Once on the main highway, I stopped at a small diner and ordered breakfast, my hands still shaking from the night before. I called the local authorities to report what had happened, describing the footprints and the noises I had heard. They took notes, promised to investigate, and said there had been reports of trespassers in the area recently, though no arrests had been made. I felt a mixture of relief and frustration, knowing that my weekend had turned into a near disaster, but also glad that no one had been hurt. I realized that the forest, as beautiful and serene as it could be during the day, was utterly unpredictable at night. Its peace was fragile, easily shattered by the wrong presence. By the time I returned home, I was exhausted but grateful. The experience left a lasting impression on me. I had gone seeking solitude and peace, but I had found a very different reality. The raw, quiet danger of being alone in a remote place where human threats were as real as any wild animal. I never returned to that cabin. Months later, I heard that police had apprehended someone trespassing in the forest not far from where I had stayed, and the description matched the footprints I had seen. It was a chilling confirmation that the threat had been very real, that the tapping and the footsteps were not figments of my imagination, and that my precautions, vigilance, and sheer luck had kept me safe. The memory stayed with me for years. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple: a few days alone in a small cabin deep in the woods, far away from roads, from the constant buzz of traffic, from the noise that seemed to settle in the mind and never leave. I had chosen the cabin because it was isolated, surrounded by thick pine and fir trees, with a small creek running a few hundred feet from the front door. The description online made it sound idyllic. Rustic, but not uncomfortable, with a wood stove for heat and a small loft for sleeping. I was not expecting comfort. I was expecting silence. And yet, when I arrived, I felt a twinge of unease I could not immediately name. The drive itself was long, more than 3 hours over narrow, winding roads that curved around hills and through dense patches of forest. My car rattled over small rocks and gravel, but the air smelled clean, wet, and piney, and the silence on the road was different from anything in the city. There were no cars behind me, no one ahead. Occasionally, I passed a logging truck or a lone hiker with a pack slung over his shoulders, and then it was just me again. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows that stretched across the road like fingers. The light caught on the windows of the cabin before I even saw the structure itself, glinting in a way that made it feel almost alive. I laughed at my own thoughts and told myself I was tired, that my mind was creating unease out of exhaustion and anticipation. The cabin was smaller than I imagined, but solid. Logs stacked neatly, chinking between them still mostly intact, and the roof sagging slightly at the center, though nothing that looked dangerous. A small porch jutted out from the front, and on it sat an old wooden chair and a stack of firewood, cut roughly and stacked with care. The windows were dusty, but clean enough to see through, and the door had a simple latch that I unlocked with the key left under the mat. I paused on the porch, taking in the smell of the forest that seemed to wrap around the cabin like a curtain. There was the faint sound of water, the creek somewhere nearby, rushing over rocks with a soft, constant murmur. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and smoke, with a faint mustiness that told me no one had spent much time there recently. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I stepped carefully, testing each one as I moved through the small space. The main room was simple. A table, 2 chairs, the wood stove in the corner, and a small shelf with a few canned goods left by the owner. There was a small loft accessible by a ladder, with a mattress and a single wool blanket. The loft itself was cramped, the ceiling low, but functional. I dropped my backpack on the floor, my stomach tightening in anticipation. For a moment, I just stood in the middle of the room, listening, feeling the silence press against me. I decided to start a fire. The wood was dry, stacked neatly beside the stove, and I pulled out the matches I had brought with me. Sparks caught on the kindling, a small flame licked the edges of the wood, and slowly the fire took hold. The warmth spread quickly through the room, carrying with it a faint, comforting scent of burning pine. I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and watched the flames dance. The shadows they cast made the corners of the room seem darker, deeper, but for now, they were comforting, alive. Outside, the forest was quiet. I thought I heard something, a rustle maybe, but it could have been the wind or a deer moving through the underbrush. I prepared a simple meal: canned beans, a few slices of bread, a small piece of cheese. Eating alone in a cabin in the woods felt both peaceful and unsettling. The isolation was intoxicating, but it also carried weight. Every sound seemed sharper, every movement outside the window more noticeable. I reminded myself that I had chosen this, that I had come here to be alone, to experience the woods in a way few people ever did. Yet, as night fell, the feeling of being watched crept in, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once I noticed it. The trees pressed close, and the shadows between them were endless, moving slightly with the wind, though nothing else stirred. I tried to sleep in the loft that first night, but I lay awake, listening. The creek murmured nearby, a constant, soothing sound, but I could hear other noises too. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, a faint dragging sound that made my stomach tighten. I told myself it was nothing, a raccoon perhaps, or a deer, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. I rolled onto my side, pulling the blanket tighter around me, trying to block out the sounds. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I slept, though lightly, waking several times to the same noises, each time my heart jumping at the sound of something outside the window or against the walls. The next day, I tried to calm myself. I chopped wood for the stove, walked along the creek, and made careful notes of the surrounding area. The forest was dense, thick with underbrush, and the terrain was uneven, with sudden drops and slippery moss-covered rocks. I marked the nearest road on a map, noting how long it would take to reach civilization if necessary. Everything seemed fine during the daylight hours, but as the sun dipped low, I felt the unease return. Shadows stretched across the cabin. The wind picked up, carrying with it scents and sounds I could not place. Sometimes I thought I saw movement in the trees, but when I looked closely, there was nothing there. By the second night, the tension had built to a low, constant pressure. I kept the fire burning, adding wood steadily, and slept with the door to the loft slightly open, peering down at the room below. Around midnight, I woke to a loud thump, as if something heavy had fallen against the side of the cabin. My heart hammered in my chest. I stayed very still, listening. Another thump, closer this time. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the door of the loft, peering out. The cabin was empty, but the sound had come from outside. I shone the light through the windows. The beam cut through the darkness, reflecting off branches, catching the bark of trees, but nothing else. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I stayed inside, shaking slightly, until the fire burned low and the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows. Morning brought relief, but the sense of danger had not disappeared. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking for signs of animals or intruders. There were tracks in the mud, human footprints. My stomach dropped. They were fresh, not more than a few hours old. I had been alone, and the nearest road was far. Whoever had made the tracks had been close, perhaps just outside the cabin at some point. My mind raced. I considered leaving immediately, but the nearest road was several miles away, and my car was parked on the other side of the forest. I decided to stay calm, to keep a low profile, and to remain alert. Over the next 2 days, I became hyper-aware of every sound, every movement outside. The forest was alive with birds and insects, but there was something else too. Subtle, deliberate movements that did not belong to animals. Twigs snapping in a pattern that suggested someone was walking slowly, cautiously, through the trees. Shadows that shifted unnaturally. The creak, once comforting, now sounded louder, more urgent, echoing in the stillness. I began to secure the cabin as best I could, reinforcing the door with a heavy chair, stacking firewood near the windows to make them harder to break through. I moved quietly, checked every corner, kept the flashlight within reach at all times. By the fourth night, the tension was unbearable. I barely slept, sitting in the loft, watching the shadows, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. I held my breath, straining to see. The beam of my flashlight caught movement. Just at the edge of the tree lean, a shadow, larger than any deer, moving slowly. I froze, heart racing, hands shaking. I realized then that this was no animal. Someone had been watching me for days, following my movements, waiting for the right moment. Panic rose in my chest, hot and sharp. I knew I could not stay passive. I gathered supplies. A large hatchet from the kitchen, extra matches, a knife, my pack with food and water. I planned my exit carefully, making mental notes of the terrain, the creek, the rocks, and the nearest trail that would lead me to the road. I waited until the early hours before dawn, when visibility was low and any intruder would be less likely to see me moving. Slowly, silently, I lowered myself from the loft, flashlight in hand, and moved to the back of the cabin. The forest was quiet, unnervingly so. My breathing was slow, controlled, and I moved step by step, keeping to the shadows, avoiding dry leaves that might crackle underfoot. By the time the sun rose, I had put significant distance between myself and the cabin. My heart still pounded, but relief began to mix with fear. I reached the trail that would lead me to the road, moving as I had been looking forward to the weekend for months, craving the quiet and isolation of the cabin my uncle owned deep in the woods. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a small wooden structure, built decades ago with rough-hewn logs, a metal roof, and a stone fireplace that had seen better days. But it promised the kind of solitude I had been yearning for. I packed my car carefully on Friday morning, filling it with food, water, extra blankets, and the small pile of books I had brought to read. I left the city behind, the noise and constant movement fading as I drove farther along the winding road that led through dense forest. The sunlight through the canopy created flickering shadows on the asphalt, and I felt an odd mix of excitement and unease. The air seemed heavier as I climbed higher, scented with damp earth and pine, the hum of civilization slowly disappearing until all I could hear was the occasional bird call and the crunch of tires on gravel. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing surrounded on all sides by thick forest, and a narrow stream ran along one side, the water bubbling quietly over stones. I parked my car next to the cabin and stepped out, the air immediately cooler and wetter than I had anticipated. The smell of moss and decaying leaves was strong, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I reminded myself that it was just the wilderness, nothing more. The first thing I noticed when I entered was the silence inside the cabin. Even in the forest, there is always some sound, but here it felt as though the building had absorbed it all. The floorboards creaked under my weight, the walls felt close and heavy, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and old dust. I carried my things in and started unpacking, setting the food in the small kitchen area and the blankets on the bed. The fireplace had been swept clean, and I found a small pile of wood stacked nearby. Outside, the sky was darkening fast, and I realized that the forest had gone quiet, too, as if everything had paused in anticipation of night. After lighting a small lantern, I started preparing a simple dinner of canned soup and bread. The light from the lantern flickered against the wooden walls, throwing shadows that danced unnaturally. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see movement among the trees, but there was nothing, just the dark, thick forest pressing in from all sides. Eating quietly, I tried to calm the small knot of unease that had formed in my chest, telling myself that it was normal to feel a little uneasy when alone in a place like this. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the forest itself was holding its breath and waiting. After dinner, I decided to light a fire in the fireplace. The smell of burning wood brought a small comfort, and I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the flames. The fire crackled and popped, throwing a warm glow across the room. Outside, the night had fully fallen, and the shadows seemed to press closer against the cabin. It was impossible to see anything beyond the faint outline of the trees. I tried to focus on my book, but the words blurred together as my mind wandered. I kept hearing noises, soft scratches, rustling outside, but every time I got up to look, there was nothing there, just the wind, perhaps, moving through the branches. I decided to go to bed early, hoping that sleep would calm my nerves. The bed was firm and scratchy, the blankets thin, but it would do. I turned off the lantern and listened to the wind in the trees. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard something heavier moving through the underbrush, like a large animal, but I told myself it was probably a deer. Still, the sound kept coming in irregular bursts, steps, scratches, rustling, and I realized that whatever it was close, very close. I stayed perfectly still, trying to pinpoint the location, but I couldn't. It moved around the cabin in a slow, cautious rhythm. I told myself again that I was imagining it. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell in the dark, and my sleep was restless. Every snap and crack from the fire, every gust of wind, made me jump. At some point, I heard a low, deliberate scraping at the side of the cabin. My heart started to hammer in my chest. I could see the faint outline of the window frames against the night sky, and I realized that something outside was circling the cabin, moving slowly, carefully, as if it knew where I was but didn't want to make too much noise. I held my breath, straining to hear, the air thick and still around me. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting barely any light at all. The scratching sound stopped, then resumed, coming closer to the front door. I remembered the small hunting knife I had brought and slid out of bed quietly. Every movement made the floorboards creak, and I had to hold myself perfectly still between steps. I crept toward the door and looked through the small window in the frame. Outside, I could just make out a shadow moving slowly along the edge of the clearing. It was large, and it didn't move like a person. My first thought was a bear or some other large animal, but something about the way it moved was deliberate, almost calculated, and my stomach dropped. I had no way to call for help. Cell service had always been spotty here, and I hadn't even checked my phone. I backed away from the door, heart racing. I realized that if this was an animal, it could easily tear through the door or the walls, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. My mind ran through every precaution I could take. I could try to barricade the door with the small furniture in the cabin, but that would only buy me a few minutes. I considered staying still and hoping it would leave, but I wasn't sure if that was safe. Every instinct told me to get out, but there was no safe way to do it without being seen. The night stretched on in a blur of fear. I stayed close to the fireplace, keeping the embers alive as best I could, hoping the fire would make me feel safer. The shadow outside shifted constantly, circling, never leaving, never coming too close. I realized that the forest was alive with sound now, with the rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches, the occasional sharp crack of something large moving in the distance. I kept imagining what could happen if it decided to attack. How quickly it could break through the door or the windows, how trapped I would be. My mind raced, calculating possibilities, weighing the risk of every move. As the night wore on, I began to notice other details I hadn't before. The forest was not entirely quiet. There were small signs of life everywhere, tracks near the edge of the clearing, broken branches, disturbed underbrush. Whatever was out there had been moving through this area for some time, not just tonight. I began to think about survival, about how to protect myself if it came closer. I remembered a small axe hanging by the fireplace, a leftover from my uncle's brief attempts at chopping firewood. It wasn't much, but it was something. I kept it close, holding it in my hands, listening to the forest, trying to predict its movements. Dawn approached slowly, the sky turning gray and muted. The shadow outside moved less now, staying near the edge of the trees, and I realized that it was retreating. I waited, tense and exhausted, until I could see clearly through the windows. The forest was alive with birds and small animals again, the occasional deer moving through the trees, but nothing large. I stepped outside cautiously, surveying the clearing. There were footprints, enormous and deep, circling the cabin, and scratches along the wooden walls where something had tested the door. The cabin had been scrutinized, inspected, perhaps even attacked, but it had held. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning up, securing the doors and windows, and thinking about what had happened. Whatever had circled the cabin had been incredibly strong, deliberate, and intelligent enough to avoid a direct confrontation. I realized that being prepared, staying calm, and thinking through every possible scenario had been what saved me. By the afternoon, I packed my things and decided to drive back down the mountain. Every sound on the road, every shadow along the tree line, made me tense, but the sun was high now, and I felt a little safer with visibility. When I returned home, I told myself that I would always remember the experience. Not just the fear, but the lessons it had taught me about vigilance, preparedness, and the unpredictability of the wilderness. The cabin was a small, simple place, but it had tested me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I realized that real danger isn't always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it is subtle, patient, and unyielding. Surviving it meant respecting the forest, and respecting the reality that, even in the quietest, most isolated places, there is always the potential for peril. And I survived. Not because I was brave, not because I was strong, but because I paid attention, acted cautiously, and never underestimated the world I had chosen to enter. I had always thought I could handle being alone in the wilderness. I had spent most of my life in cities, but there was something about the idea of being completely isolated that called to me. A small cabin deep in the forest, far from roads or towns, seemed like the perfect escape from the noise and responsibilities of life. I found it listed online, a modest structure tucked between pine trees, accessible only by a rough dirt path. The pictures showed a sturdy wooden cabin, a small porch, and a creek running nearby. It looked peaceful, That was enough for me. I packed my car with supplies, not realizing that what awaited me would test my sense of control and awareness in ways I had never imagined. The drive-in was long and uncomfortable. The roads became narrower as I ventured farther from the town, twisting and turning between dense trees, potholes, and rocks. At some points, the canopy was so thick that sunlight barely reached the car. I remember noticing the smell of damp earth mixed with pine, an odor both comforting and oppressive in its intensity. Eventually, I reached a clearing, and the cabin appeared exactly as it had in the photos. The creek babbled nearby, and a thin trail led away from the cabin into the deeper woods. I parked and stepped out, taking in the quiet. It was the kind of quiet that almost felt loud because there was nothing to distract you from the small sounds. The creek, the wind, the occasional bird. I carried my bags to the cabin, feeling a thrill of accomplishment. I had no plans to see anyone for the next week, and that felt liberating. The cabin itself was small but functional. A single room with a wood stove, a bed, a table, and a few chairs. A small kitchen area with a sink, some basic utensils, and an old fridge. There was a firewood stack just outside the door. I unpacked my supplies, checking the food and water I had brought. I had planned everything meticulously. Canned goods, dry pasta, fresh water, a camping stove just in case, and extra batteries for my flashlight. My phone signal was spotty at best, which I actually found comforting. I wanted solitude, and I had it. For the first day, I wandered around the nearby area, collecting firewood, exploring the creek, and noting landmarks in case I needed to orient myself later. The air smelled like wet earth and pine, and there was a strange beauty in the undisturbed forest. That night, the isolation settled in more deeply than I had expected. I sat on the porch as the sun set, watching shadows creep across the clearing. The temperature dropped quickly, and I could see my breath. The sound of the creek was louder in the dark, and I found myself listening to the woods as if they were whispering secrets I could not understand. I went inside and built a fire in the stove, feeling its warmth seep through the cabin. I tried to read, but my thoughts kept drifting. This was the kind of solitude that forces you to confront yourself, the quiet that feels heavy, almost oppressive because there is nothing to hide behind. I went to bed early, exhausted from the hike and carrying supplies, and slept fitfully, waking occasionally to the wind rattling the windows. The next morning, I woke to a noise outside the cabin, a branch snapping somewhere in the distance. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to tell myself it was just an animal. The forest was full of them. Deer, raccoons, maybe a bear. I had seen tracks near the creek, and I knew animals could be curious, even dangerous. I went outside with my flashlight, scanning the edges of the clearing. There was nothing but trees, shadows, and the creek flowing calmly. I tried to shake the unease and spent the day chopping more firewood, filling the stove, and cooking a simple meal. But every now and then, I heard noises that made me pause. A rustling in the underbrush, a low thump like something heavy moving in the distance. I kept my knife within reach, telling myself that my mind was playing tricks because of isolation. By the third day, the sense of being watched had grown stronger. I noticed subtle signs. Footprints near the creek that seemed too large to be mine, disturbed foliage at the edge of the clearing, a faint smell of smoke in the air that I had not made. I rationalized it at first, thinking maybe a hiker had passed through, though the odds seemed unlikely. The cabin was supposed to be miles from any real trail. That night, I double-checked the locks and ensured my firewood stack was close, just in case. Sleep was nearly impossible. Every sound felt amplified. The creek, the wind, the snapping of branches. My mind raced with possibilities, some rational, some paranoid. On the fourth day, I decided to explore farther into the forest, partly to distract myself and partly to understand my surroundings. I followed a faint trail I had seen near the creek. The underbrush was thick, the air humid, and the forest floor uneven. I had my flashlight and knife moving carefully. The further I went, the more I noticed signs of human presence. Discarded cans, faint tire tracks, a makeshift fire pit. It seemed unlikely that anyone should have been here recently, yet the evidence was undeniable. My anxiety grew, I returned to the cabin quickly, constantly scanning the tree line for movement. The cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a target in the middle of nowhere. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard something approaching. Not just the wind or a deer, but heavy footsteps breaking twigs, moving slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. My stomach dropped. I stayed silent, crouching behind the table, heart hammering. The steps paused, then resumed in a different direction. I realized someone or something was circling the cabin. I had brought a gun for emergencies, but had never imagined I would need it like this. I kept my flashlight ready and stayed as quiet as possible. The noise continued for hours, each snap of a branch sending adrenaline surging through me. Eventually, it faded, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The next morning, I inspected the perimeter. Footprints in the mud were clear and much larger than mine. They formed a rough circle around the cabin. I checked the windows and doors. Nothing appeared forced, but the evidence of presence was undeniable. I spent the day barricading the cabin as best I could, stacking chairs against the doors, placing firewood near the windows, keeping my knife and flashlight within reach at all times. The forest that had felt peaceful now felt hostile. Every sound, every movement in the trees made me jump. I realized that my initial assumption that I could handle isolation had been naive. Isolation was one thing. Being alone with a potential human threat was another entirely. On the 5th day, I woke to find more signs of intrusion. My food had been disturbed, a can slightly dented, the fridge door left ajar. I knew then that someone had been inside while I was asleep. Panic set in, but I forced myself to remain calm. I documented everything, writing notes, taking pictures, and reinforcing the cabin even further. I realized that the best course of action was to stay put and avoid confrontation. I rationed my supplies, checked my maps, and planned potential escape routes. The nearest ranger station was a few hours away on foot, but the forest was dense and could easily hide someone following me. That night, I stayed awake, rotating between sitting near the windows and checking the doors. I noticed faint shadows moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. My stomach twisted in fear, but I did not panic. I was exhausted but aware that any lapse could be dangerous. Hours passed, and eventually the shadows receded. By dawn, I had slept only a few restless minutes. On the 6th day, I decided I could not continue like this. I had to get out of the forest safely. I packed my essential supplies into a backpack: water, food, knife, flashlight, and a first aid kit. I left the cabin as quietly as possible, sticking to the tree line for cover. Every crack of a branch made me freeze. Every rustle in the bushes had me scanning for movement. Hours passed, and I relied on my map and compass, moving cautiously but steadily toward a road I had marked. I was dehydrated and hungry, but fear sharpened my senses. At one point, I saw footprints alongside mine, larger and heavier, but I refused to look too long. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I finally emerged onto a dirt road. I collapsed beside it, exhausted and relieved. I flagged down a passing car and explained my situation as best as I could, too tired to fully articulate the fear and tension I had experienced. They called the authorities, and soon a ranger team arrived to escort me back to safety. They checked the cabin and the surrounding area. There were no signs of the person who had been stalking the place, only footprints and minor disturbances. The isolation, the wilderness, and the fear of being hunted had been enough to nearly break me mentally, but I had survived by remaining calm, alert, and rational. In the end, the experience left me with a complex sense of relief and caution. I realized that while I had romanticized isolation and self-sufficiency, real wilderness survival. I drove into the forest late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low over the horizon, painting the trees in long golden shadows. My car was loaded with supplies: food, water, extra clothes, a first aid kit, and camping gear. But I could feel my stomach tightening with a mix of excitement and unease. I had rented a cabin for a week, far away from the city, to clear my mind. I had done my research and knew that the area was remote with very few people around, but the idea of isolation never really hit me until I saw the long, narrow dirt road that led deeper into the forest. The road was bumpy, littered with small rocks and fallen branches. My tires crunched against the gravel as I drove slowly, following the GPS coordinates that the cabin owner had sent me. I kept an eye on the edges of the forest. The trees were thick, their trunks dark and weathered, their branches twisting into strange angles. Birds were quiet, the usual sounds of a forest, chirping, rustling, the distant calls of animals were barely there. It felt heavy and silent in a way that made me tense. I tried to tell myself it was normal. Remote areas are quiet, nothing to worry about. After almost an hour, I finally arrived at a small clearing where the cabin sat. It was older than I expected, a single-story log structure with a steep roof and a porch that ran across the front. The wood was weathered, some of it gray and rough to the touch. There were no other houses or cabins nearby, no other lights, nothing but the forest stretching in every direction. I turned off the car, feeling the engine die down, and stepped out. The air was cooler than I expected, and I shivered. There was a faint smell of pine and earth, damp in some areas where the sun didn't reach. The cabin door was unlocked, as the owner had promised. I stepped inside and immediately noticed the smell of old wood and dust. There was a living area with a small, worn sofa, a kitchen with minimal utensils, and a bedroom with a bed that looked recently used but clean. There was a wood stove in the corner. I dropped my bag on the floor and took a deep breath, trying to relax. This was going to be fine. Just me, the forest, and a week of solitude. I unpacked my things, set up my sleeping area, and stacked some firewood near the stove. Outside, the sun had disappeared completely, and the forest had turned dark. I lit a lantern in the cabin, its yellow glow filling the room. It was peaceful for a while. I sat down on the sofa, sipping water from my bottle, listening to the forest outside. That's when I noticed it. A faint cracking sound, like a branch breaking, coming from somewhere close. I froze, straining my ears. Then it stopped. I tried to convince myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon maybe. The forest was full of them. I decided to ignore it. Night fell fully, and I prepared a small meal. The only sounds were the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. I sat by the stove, eating quietly, feeling the isolation settle around me like a heavy blanket. It was calming in one sense, but also unnerving. My mind wandered, thinking about what I would do during the week. Hiking, reading, writing. I wanted to focus on that, but there was a tight knot in my stomach I couldn't shake. Around midnight, I went to bed. The cabin was cold despite the stove, and I had to pile blankets over myself. I tried to sleep, but every little noise seemed louder than it should be. Branches scratching against the windows, the wind moving the trees, something heavy thumping in the distance. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, but every time I looked out, there was nothing. I told myself I was imagining things. The next morning, I woke early, the first light filtering through the small windows. I decided to take a short hike around the cabin to stretch my legs. I grabbed my backpack, a water bottle, and a small knife for protection. The trail was narrow and uneven, winding through dense undergrowth. As I walked, I noticed signs of wildlife. Tracks in the dirt, broken twigs, and occasionally the remnants of small animal nests. The forest seemed alive, but it also felt watchful, as if it was observing me as I moved. I shook the thought off. Later that day, I realized I had forgotten to check the cabin supplies properly. I went back and examined the stove, the lanterns, and the food. Everything was there. But as I unpacked a box of matches, I noticed something strange. The woodpile I had stacked the day before had been disturbed slightly. Some logs were shifted as if someone or something had been there. My heart started to race. I looked around the cabin. Nothing was out of place otherwise. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it must have been an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. I spent the rest of the day hiking along a marked trail a few miles from the cabin. The forest was thick, and sunlight barely reached the ground. I noticed more signs that someone or something had been moving through the area. Flattened patches of grass, broken branches, footprints I couldn't identify. I took note of them but kept going, hoping I was being paranoid. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin, feeling uneasy but not panicked. I double-checked the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. As night fell again, the noises outside became more pronounced. I heard scraping against the cabin walls, twigs snapping under weight, and low, almost imperceptible shuffling. My mind raced. I realized I had no cell signal. If anything happened, no one could reach me. The isolation I had wanted suddenly felt like a trap. I tried to stay calm, keeping the lanterns lit and the door locked. I stayed awake most of the night, watching the windows, listening. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow made my heart pound. On the third day, I decided to explore further, hoping keeping busy would help. I packed a small bag and started down a wider trail that led away from the cabin. The trail was rarely used, overgrown in places, and littered with fallen branches. I walked for hours, occasionally stopping to take notes on the flora and fauna. Everything seemed normal until I came across a small clearing. There, I saw a makeshift campfire, long cold and covered with leaves, and footprints around it, large human footprints. My stomach sank. Someone had been here recently. I tried to tell myself it could be hikers, but the footprints were fresh enough to suggest within the last day. I quickly turned back, feeling a knot of fear tighten in my chest. Returning to the cabin, I decided to stay inside for the rest of the day. I secured the doors and windows, stacked more wood in front of the door as a precaution, and tried to keep busy by cleaning and organizing supplies. I refused to go outside after dark. When night came, the noises resumed. I could hear footsteps circling the cabin, soft at first, then heavier, more deliberate. The sound of twigs breaking nearby made me flinch every time. I realized that whoever or whatever was outside, they were aware of my presence. That thought made me feel trapped, exposed, and extremely vulnerable. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I kept the stove lit and sat in the corner of the room, knife in hand, listening. At one point, I thought I heard a low voice whispering through the trees, but it was faint, impossible to identify. I forced myself to believe it was just the wind, but doubt lingered. My mind raced with scenarios, burglars, hunters, trespassers, but I had no way to know. I spent the entire night waiting, alert, my nerves fraying. The next morning, I decided I had to get out, but I knew driving down the forest road could be dangerous if someone was still nearby. I packed my bag quickly, taking only essentials, and prepared to leave quietly. Before stepping outside, I peeked through the window and froze. Footprints led from the edge of the forest to the cabin and back. Someone had been walking around the cabin while I was asleep. My heart pounded. I had to get out. I waited for the first light of day, then left quickly, trying to stay quiet. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly around me, each tree casting long shadows that made me feel even more trapped. I followed the road, trying to remain calm, watching the edges for movement. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I drove slowly, tense, every nerve alert. About an hour down the road, I saw a faint plume of smoke rising in the distance. Relief washed over me. It was another cabin or a small village. Civilization. Safety. I reached the road that connected to the main highway and drove as fast as I dared, my heart still racing. When I finally reached a gas station, I pulled in and locked the doors. I called the local authorities and reported the strange footprints and disturbances. They took me seriously, and I gave them all the details I could. A ranger was dispatched to check the area, and I stayed at the gas station until they arrived. The ranger confirmed that the cabin area had been recently visited by trespassers, likely squatters or hunters. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The city felt suffocating, crowded, loud, and permanent, and I needed space to breathe, to think, and to feel some kind of peace that didn't involve traffic lights or sirens. I found a small cabin online, nestled deep in the woods of northern Maine, far from any town, far from any other human presence. The website made it look charming. Rough-hewn logs, a small stone chimney, a little deck overlooking the trees. The pictures were quiet, almost silent, the way I imagined the forest itself would be. I booked it immediately, longing for a few days alone. The drive there took longer than I expected. Even with GPS, the roads became narrower, less maintained, and eventually dissolved into gravel paths that twisted unervingly through dense trees. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low, and the forest around me looked as though it had swallowed the day whole. The cabin was exactly as described, though smaller than I imagined. It sat on a slight rise, with the forest pressing close from all sides. There was a thin path leading to a creek behind it, the sound of running water faint but constant. The air smelled sharp and clean, tinged with pine and damp earth, and I immediately felt some of the tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying begin to loosen. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living area with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen corner, a bed shoved into one corner, and a bathroom that looked serviceable if not entirely modern. The wood smelled faintly musty but comforting, and the small windows allowed slivers of fading light to come in. I unpacked slowly, taking in every detail, listening to the quiet. It was the kind of silence that was not absolute. It had layers. There was the hum of the wind through the trees, the occasional bird calling from a branch, the soft sound of something brushing against leaves far off. I moved cautiously, almost as if the cabin were alive in some way, though I knew rationally that it wasn't. I planned to spend the first night reading by the fire, cooking something simple, and letting myself feel alone in a way I hadn't in years. I chopped some wood from a stack near the cabin, small logs that fit easily in the fireplace, and I felt an unfamiliar satisfaction in the physical labor. The sunset filtered through the trees, creating strange, shifting patterns on the cabin walls. I made a small fire and sat close to it, feeling warmth seep into my chest and into my tired limbs. Outside, the forest darkened slowly, shadows lengthening and thickening, until the trees were barely visible beyond the edges of the deck. The only sound now was the distant creak and the occasional rustle from the underbrush. Around 10 o'clock, I realized I should probably close the cabin up for the night. I locked the door, latched the windows, and checked the small flashlights I had brought. The forest beyond the windows was black now, the outlines of trees only faintly visible in the moonlight. I went to bed but did not sleep immediately. Instead, I listened. Every snapping twig, every brush of leaves, seemed amplified in the stillness. My mind started filling in shapes, movements, patterns that weren't really there. I told myself it was just the way the forest sounds in the dark. I told myself that until finally, the slow, steady sound of the creek lulled me to a light, uneasy sleep. I woke at around 2 in the morning. The cabin was cold. The fire had died, leaving only the faint smell of smoke. At first, I thought I had heard someone outside. A snapping sound, like a branch breaking under weight, had come from the edge of the property, close to the treeline. I sat up, straining my eyes in the darkness, trying to tell if it was an animal, a tree branch falling, or someone walking. The sound came again, closer this time, deliberate in a way that set my teeth on edge. My stomach clenched. I had told myself before I arrived that no one could get here easily, that it was just miles of dense forest and dirt roads. But the sound had weight, and it did not seem accidental. I waited, listening. The forest was otherwise silent now. No wind, no birds, just that snapping and rustling at the edge of the treeline. I realized I had left the small flashlight on the table, and I reached for it, my hands trembling. The light cut a narrow path through the blackness of the cabin, but it revealed nothing outside. I trained it on the trees. Shadows moved slightly, but I couldn't tell if it was imagination or actual movement. The snapping came again, followed by a soft, dragging sound, like something heavy moving along the ground. My heart was pounding. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it had to be a deer or maybe a raccoon, something normal. But the dragging noise continued, deliberate, methodical. It circled the cabin, coming from the left side, moving around behind the building, then stopped near the back. I remembered the kitchen knife I had set on the counter while cooking. I grabbed it, holding it tightly, feeling the cool metal against my palm. I moved slowly to the small window that faced the back. Through the glass, I could just make out the shadows of trees and the slight glint of the moon on something wet and dark on the ground. I couldn't tell what it was, but my mind began filling in the blanks in the worst possible ways. I backed away from the window, moving toward the door. If someone had come this far, I was trapped in the cabin with no real way out in the dark. My phone had no signal. I could hear the distant sound of the creek, but that was it. No road, no lights. I spent the next few minutes holding my breath, listening for movement. Then came a soft scratching at the side of the cabin, near the deck. Someone or something was outside. I held the knife in front of me, ready. My mind raced, thinking about ways to barricade the door with furniture, anything I could use. I tried to convince myself that the person outside might leave, that they had no reason to stay. But the scratching turned into deliberate knocks, slow and heavy. Someone wanted in. My chest tightened, panic mixing with the cold sweat forming on my back. I wanted to call for help, but I knew I couldn't. No signal, no neighbor, no town nearby. I was truly alone. The knocking stopped suddenly. Silence fell. I held the knife tightly, my knuckles white, my ears strained to catch any sound. Then came a dragging noise again, closer this time, just outside the cabin wall I was next to. I realized that whatever it was circling the building, testing every weak point. My mind refused to accept that this could be a random animal. The weight and persistence were too human, too deliberate. I crouched behind the table, pressing myself low, trying to make myself invisible in the darkness. My thoughts spun. I needed a plan. If this person or people came in, I had no chance in the dark, small space. I remembered the propane lantern in the corner. If I could light it, I could see, but I would also give away my position. I had to wait. I had no choice but to wait. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. I could hear every small noise outside. The snap of a twig, the crunch of leaves, the soft patter of something moving. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the sounds began moving away. Slowly, cautiously, I tracked the faint noises as they receded into the forest. My body shook uncontrollably, muscles tense, stomach churning. I didn't dare breathe until I was certain the threat had left. When I finally allowed myself to exhale, it was deep, ragged, exhausted. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting close to the fireplace, knife in hand, listening to every sound, my nerves stretched to a raw edge. Morning came with a gray, heavy sky. I forced myself to sleep in short bursts, exhausted but alert. When I finally ventured outside, the forest was silent, almost unnaturally so. The ground around the cabin bore marks, footprints, broken branches, evidence of someone or something circling the cabin in the night. I felt a mix of fear and relief, knowing I had survived, but also knowing that the solitude I had sought had turned into a danger I hadn't anticipated. I spent the day cautiously exploring the area around the cabin, noting escape routes, places to hide, and trying to convince myself that this had been the only night, that whoever or whatever had been there was gone. By evening, I had a plan. I would not stay another night. I packed quickly, checked every lock, and made sure my car was ready. I kept the knife close, a small reassurance against the lingering fear. The drive back to the main road was tense. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow along the roadside made my heart jump. I didn't stop until I reached a small town, the lights and noise of civilization washing over me like a bomb. I booked a motel, and I spent the next 2 nights unable to sleep properly, the memory of the cabin and the dark forest still pressing on me. In the end, I learned that solitude can be deceptive. The peace I sought existed only as long as the danger did not. And in that cabin, deep in the woods, I realized that fear can be real. I had been driving for hours, the tires of my old car crunching over the gravel roads that snaked through dense pine forests. The sunlight was fading behind the horizon, and the orange glow of the evening reflected off the trees in sharp, long shadows. I was tired, but I had a strange sense of excitement. I had rented a small cabin in the middle of nowhere, far from the crowded towns, just me and the wilderness. The description online had been simple: a wooden cabin, a fireplace, a small lake nearby, no neighbors for miles. Perfect, I thought. I wanted to be alone, to disconnect from the constant buzz of work and messages, to just breathe. The last stretch of the road was narrow and uneven. The trees grew close together, their branches reaching across the path as if trying to grab my car. Every now and then, a fallen branch or rock forced me to swerve slightly, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than I realized. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, the last of the sunlight had disappeared, and a pale twilight had settled over everything. The cabin looked small and weathered, made of rough timber, with a little porch that creaked under the weight of snow in the previous winter. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, though I was sure no one else was supposed to be there. I parked, shut off the car, and took a deep breath. The air was cold, sharp with the smell of pine and wet earth. I grabbed my backpack, which had only essentials: food, water, a lantern, some matches, and a small first aid kit. My plan was simple: settle in, make a fire, and enjoy a quiet night alone. The door of the cabin opened easily, though it groaned as it swung inward. Inside, the cabin was small but tidy. There was a single room with a fireplace on one wall, a small kitchen area, a table and a bed in the corner. The windows were dusty, but the view of the forest beyond was clear. I set my things down, took off my jacket, and went to light the fireplace. The matches struck easily, and soon a warm, flickering light filled the room, painting the walls in shades of orange and gold. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves outside, the distant call of a bird settling for the night, the low whisper of wind through the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I made myself a simple meal from the canned food I had brought and ate slowly, savoring the quiet. The cabin seemed to hug me with its silence, insulating me from the world outside. After cleaning up, I sank into the bed with a blanket wrapped tightly around me, feeling the warmth of the fire on my face. I had brought a notebook to write in, but I felt too relaxed to open it. Sleep came easily. I woke up hours later to a noise I couldn't immediately identify. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was different, rhythmic, deliberate. A soft thumping, like something heavy being dragged across the ground outside. My heart started to race, and I froze, listening. It stopped. Then, after a few seconds, it started again, moving closer to the cabin. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But something about the timing didn't feel natural. I got up slowly, keeping close to the wall, and peered out the window. The darkness outside made it impossible to see clearly. The trees loomed like black towers, the forest floor lost in shadows. I picked up the small flashlight from the table, switching it on and pointing it toward the ground. There, moving just at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. At first, I thought it might be a man in a dark jacket, crouched low, moving carefully. My stomach dropped. I had read about hikers or hunters getting lost in the forest, but this felt different. The figure stopped abruptly, as if it had sensed me watching. I froze, holding my breath, and it seemed to look in my direction. Then, without warning, it turned and melted back into the trees. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I knew I should call the police, but there was barely any signal out here. My phone had one bar at best, and I wasn't even sure I could make a call. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just a hunter or someone passing through, but the uneasy feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, then moved quietly to the bedroom corner with the flashlight and a heavy kitchen knife I had grabbed from the counter. Hours passed like that. Every sound outside, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an animal, made me jump. I didn't dare leave the cabin, didn't dare go near the door. At some point, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I managed to fall into a fitful sleep, the knife clutched in my hand. When I woke, it was morning. The sunlight poured in through the windows, and for a moment, the world felt normal again. I got up cautiously, still expecting to see someone lurking outside, but the clearing was empty. No sign of anyone. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. I exhaled slowly, convincing myself that I had imagined the whole thing. I decided to explore a little, to walk toward the lake I knew was nearby. Maybe being outside in the daylight would make me feel safer. The path to the lake was narrow and overgrown, with tall grasses and saplings brushing against my legs. Birds chirped in the trees, and the sun sparkled on the surface of the water. It was beautiful, almost serene. I knelt by the edge, letting my fingers skim the cold water, and for a moment, I felt relief. But as I turned back toward the cabin, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the soft earth led from the forest to the clearing, and they didn't stop. They were fresh, human footprints, larger than mine, heading straight toward the cabin. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here while I slept. Someone had been watching me. I ran back to the cabin, fumbling with the lock, and then I realized something worse. The door I had locked before going to bed had scratches all along its bottom edge, deep enough to suggest that whatever had been trying to get in was strong, determined. My mind raced. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I packed my backpack quickly, taking only essentials, and slipped out a back window, careful not to make noise. The forest outside felt different now, darker, heavier. Every rustle of leaves sounded like someone following me. I ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, not stopping until I reached the main road. The sun was high now, and the light gave me courage, but I still kept glancing behind me, imagining figures in the shadows. By the time I reached a small town several miles down the road, I was exhausted, muddy, and shaken. I went straight to the local police station, telling them everything, showing them the photographs of the cabin and the tracks. They took my report seriously, and a few days later, deputies went back to the cabin. What they found confirmed my fears. Someone had been living in the woods near that cabin, moving silently, watching, even entering the cabin when it was empty. They had left evidence of a makeshift campsite, old food wrappers, and other signs of long-term presence. The deputies never found the person, and I never went back to that cabin. I sold my rental rights and never tried anything like that again. But sometimes, when I drive through forests or see a cabin off in the distance, I can't help but remember that night. The way the dark seemed to move just at the edge of my vision, the sound of footsteps in the quiet, and the cold, inescapable realization that someone had been there, watching me, waiting. I learned something that night that I will never forget. Wilderness may seem peaceful, but there are things out there that watch, and sometimes they come closer than you ever expect. I had planned the trip for months, mapping out the route to the cabin in my head, imagining every step of it, every detail of the trees, the road, and the silence I would find there. I wanted solitude, and I wanted to test myself against the quiet, away from the noise and distractions of the city. The cabin was small, built decades ago by a man who had wanted to escape life entirely, and then it had been sold off to the county when he disappeared. I didn't know much about it beyond the fact that it stood on a small clearing, deep in a state forest, accessible only by a rough dirt road that twisted and sank into the undergrowth the further you went. The maps marked it, but they didn't show how easy it would be to get lost along the way, or how deceptive the forest could be in its calmness. I left early, before dawn, so the road would be empty. The sky was gray, and the air had that damp, sharp edge that smelled like rain even though none had fallen yet. My car rattled over the stones and potholes, and every few minutes I had to slow down to make sure I didn't hit something hidden in the road. I kept my backpack in the passenger seat, packed with the essentials: water, canned food, a small stove, matches, a first aid kit, and a couple of knives. I also brought a flashlight, though I hoped not to need it until night. The further I drove, the fewer signs of human life there were. Every now and then, I would see a bird flash through the trees or a fox dart across the road. I felt a small thrill of excitement in the isolation, a sense of something pure and untouched. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, The sun was rising, filtering through the trees in long, weak shafts of gold. The cabin looked exactly like the photos I had seen online, though in reality it was smaller, more worn, with the paint peeling and the wood darkened from years of rain. The windows were dusty, and the door sagged slightly on its hinges. I parked my car nearby and stepped out, stretching my arms and feeling the chill of the morning air. The forest was completely quiet, except for the occasional creak of the cabin and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I felt a moment of satisfaction, knowing I would be alone here for the next few days, completely removed from the world. Inside, the cabin was small and sparsely furnished. There was a single room with a small wood stove, a table, and a few chairs. A bed was tucked into a corner, with a thin mattress and old blankets. I set my backpack down and began to unpack, arranging my supplies so I could access them easily. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I found myself jumping slightly at every noise. But it wasn't fear exactly, it was awareness, a heightened sense of being alive. I filled the stove with wood and managed to get a fire going. The smell of burning wood filled the cabin, mingling with the dampness that seemed to cling to the walls. The first day passed quietly. I explored the small clearing around the cabin, noting the trees and the way the forest thickened in every direction. I found a small stream nearby and filled my water bottles. The isolation was complete. I spent hours simply walking, listening to the birds and the wind. By evening, I had returned to the cabin, lit the fire again, and prepared a simple meal. I felt content, almost smug, in my solitude. I went to bed early, expecting to be lulled to sleep by the sounds of the forest. But instead I found that the dark brought its own sense of unease. Shadows from the fire flickered against the walls, and every creak of the cabin sounded sharper than it had during the day. It was during the second night that I first realized how alone I truly was. I had woken to a faint sound outside the cabin, footsteps on the ground, soft but deliberate. I froze, straining to hear. The cabin was small, and every sound echoed, making it hard to judge the distance. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the footsteps had a weight to them, a rhythm that felt human. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the window, the beam cutting through the darkness outside. There was nothing there. I stayed awake for hours after, checking the locks on the door and peering out into the trees, but eventually exhaustion won. The next day, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. I went for a long walk deeper into the forest, moving carefully along trails that had once been marked but were now almost completely overgrown. I noticed how quickly the forest could change. A path that seemed clear a moment ago would suddenly be blocked by fallen branches, thick undergrowth, or a marshy patch. I realized how easy it would be to lose my bearings, how even someone like me, with a map and a compass, could wander for hours and end up somewhere unknown. I kept track of the landmarks as best I could. A large oak with a broken branch, a cluster of rocks near the stream, a small hill that gave a view of the surrounding trees. I felt a strange mix of awe and tension. The forest was beautiful, yes, but indifferent, and that indifference carried a subtle threat. When I returned to the cabin, the feeling of being watched had intensified. The door had a scratch along its frame that I was certain hadn't been there before. I checked the locks, the windows, every corner of the cabin. Nothing seemed disturbed, nothing taken, but the scratch remained, and I felt my pulse quicken. I told myself it could have been caused by a branch or an animal, but deep down I knew the shape and placement were too deliberate. That night, I stayed awake almost the entire time, listening to the sounds of the forest, listening for the footsteps that had haunted my first night. I had a knife in my hand, ready to defend myself, and yet I also knew that the cabin offered little protection if someone intended to harm me. By the third day, I decided to confront my fear with action. I took a walk along the main dirt road, hoping that the visibility and openness would calm me. The road stretched straight for a while before disappearing into dense trees, the sunlight broken by the shifting canopy. As I walked, I noticed signs that someone else had been here recently. Broken twigs, footprints pressed into soft mud, a cigarette butt lying on the edge of the road. My heart began to race. I had thought I would be alone, and suddenly I realized that I might not be. The isolation I had craved now felt fragile, as though it could be shattered by a single person with the wrong intentions. I turned back to the cabin, deciding to stay closer to it, to avoid the risk of wandering into someone else's presence. That night, the sounds returned, more distinct this time. Footsteps circling the cabin, moving deliberately, pausing, then moving again. I could hear the crunch of gravel, the snapping of branches, and sometimes the brushing of leaves against the cabin's walls. I didn't sleep. I barricaded the door with furniture, and I sat by the fire with the knife in my hand, watching the shadows outside. The wind rose in the early hours of the morning, rattling the roof and sending a few loose shingles clattering to the ground. The footsteps stopped when the wind began, and I realized I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in the chest, loud against the deafening quiet. By the fourth day, I knew I needed a plan. I could not stay in the cabin forever, and I also could not risk being outside unprepared. I decided to wait until nightfall, then leave quietly by the back of the cabin, sticking to the tree line and making my way to the main road. I packed my bag with everything I might need, keeping the knife and flashlight on top. I made a mental map of the route, memorizing landmarks, and tried to calm my racing mind. As darkness fell, I moved carefully along the side of the cabin, checking every shadow, every movement in the forest. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of wet leaves and wood, and every sound seemed amplified. Then I saw movement, a figure crouched low among the trees watching. I froze, heart pounding. I realized there was no mistake. Someone had been near the cabin all along. I did not have time to react with strategy or cleverness. I ran, sticking to the shadows, moving quietly but as fast as possible, keeping low. I reached the dirt road, and I could hear the figure behind me, moving faster now, breaking branches, shouting. I sprinted toward my car, adrenaline blinding me to everything else. The figure chased me for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. I jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and drove without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, hours away. I called the police, who returned with officers to search the area. They found no one near the cabin when they arrived, but they did find the footprints and signs of someone hiding in the trees, watching for days. The cabin had not been disturbed, but the realization that I was not alone in the forest, that someone had followed me, lived near me in the shadows, it changed everything. I never returned to that cabin. I learned that the forest was not simply isolation and beauty. It could be a trap, a place where someone could watch and wait, where solitude could turn to danger without warning. Even now, I think about that cabin, about the silence that was not silent, about the footsteps that came and went with the wind. I keep a knife by my bed, I check the locks twice, and I never wander into the forest without letting someone know exactly where I am. I had been planning this cabin trip for months, ever since I first stumbled across the listing online. It was a small, rustic cabin in the mountains, isolated enough that cell service barely reached it, yet close enough to a small town for emergencies. I wanted a real break from the city, a place where I could disconnect completely, spend a few days alone with my thoughts, the forest, and the silence. The pictures had shown it surrounded by dense woods, with a little creek running nearby, the kind of place where sunlight breaks through the trees in soft beams and the air smells clean, untouched. I didn't need much else, just the cabin, the woods, and a few days away from everyone else. I packed carefully. I didn't overdo it, but I brought enough food, water, and supplies to last a week. I included a first aid kit, a few extra blankets, a decent flashlight with extra batteries, a small camping stove, and my camping gear. I had a heavy jacket and hiking boots, and I brought along a few books to read, though I suspected I wouldn't spend much time reading. The drive there was long, a little over 3 hours from my apartment, but it gave me time to mentally prepare for the solitude. I like solitude, but I also like safety, so I double-checked the directions and mapped the route carefully. The drive was peaceful. The road climbed steadily as the city faded behind me, replaced by tall pines and firs, mountains rising in the distance like silent, watching giants. The smell of pine filled the car as I opened the windows. I noticed small changes along the route. More rocks on the road, narrower paths, streams crossing underneath small wooden bridges. At some points, the road narrowed so much I had to inch forward carefully, checking both sides to make sure the tires didn't slip. But everything felt calm. The further I drove, the quieter it became. Even the birds seemed fewer as I approached the cabin area. Finally, I reached the last turn. A thin dirt road branching off the main path, barely noticeable unless you knew it was there. I followed it, bouncing slightly on the uneven ground. The trees were so close together that sunlight barely reached the road, but it was still bright outside. I could hear the faint trickle of water somewhere off to the side, probably the creek I had seen on the listing. After what felt like 10 minutes, the trees opened up slightly, and there it was, the cabin, small, wooden, and unpainted, blending into the forest like it had always belonged there. I parked my car on the small patch of dirt in front and got out, stretching my legs. The air was fresh and cold, with a slight wind rustling through the leaves. The smell of wet soil and pine filled my nose. The cabin was simple. A single story, maybe 30 feet wide, with a small porch running along the front. I could see the stack of firewood neatly piled on the side. I grabbed my pack and walked up the steps, my boots crunching softly on the wooden boards. The door opened easily with the key I had been given, and I stepped inside. The cabin smelled faintly of old wood and something earthy, like it hadn't been used in a while. Dust lay in small layers on the floor, and the furniture was simple but functional. There was a small kitchen area with a stove and sink, a table, a few chairs, a sofa, and a bed in a corner. I set my pack down and immediately started organizing my things. I unpacked the food into the small cabinets, laid out my blankets, and checked the stove and water supply. Everything seemed in working order, and for a moment I felt the relief of being in a secure place. I sat for a while just listening. Outside, the creek flowed gently, the wind moved through the trees, and somewhere far away a bird called. No other sounds reached me. It was perfect. I spent the afternoon exploring the area. The creek was shallow but clear, water running over rocks and around fallen branches. I followed it upstream for a while, careful not to slip on wet stones. The forest was dense, the trees tall and straight, their roots twisting over rocks and soil. Occasionally, I saw deer tracks, maybe a fox trail, and I even glimpsed a bird of prey circling overhead. The isolation was strange but exhilarating. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the clearing. I gathered some firewood from the stack, built a small fire outside in a safe stone circle, and watched the flames flicker. As night fell, the forest changed. The sounds became sharper, closer. I could hear the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, maybe raccoons or squirrels. The creek gurgled gently. The wind whispered through the trees. I went inside, lit the small lamps, and made a simple dinner on the stove. I ate slowly, listening. Outside, something large moved in the darkness. I didn't panic. I had read enough wilderness guides to know it could be a deer or some other large animal. Still, the sound of something heavy stepping on dry leaves made me alert. I checked the windows. Nothing was visible, just the dark outlines of trees and the faint glimmer of the creek. I decided to go to bed early. The cabin was quiet now, the fire dying outside. I made sure the door was locked, the windows shut, and my flashlight was on the nightstand. I crawled under the blankets, feeling a mixture of calm and tension. The silence was deep. Eventually, I fell asleep. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound I hadn't anticipated. Scratching. It was faint at first, like someone tapping on the wooden siding, then louder, more deliberate. My heart jumped. I lay still, listening. The cabin was otherwise silent, the wind not strong enough to make noise like that. I considered calling someone, but my phone had no signal. I got up slowly, grabbed my flashlight, and shone it around the cabin. Nothing. The fire outside was gone, leaving the clearing in near darkness. I checked all the doors again. They were locked. The scratching had stopped. I lay back down, tense, but eventually drifted into uneasy sleep. The next day, I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably an animal, Maybe a raccoon trying to get into the firewood, maybe a larger animal brushing against the siding. I spent the morning chopping some firewood and making a stronger fire outside. I stayed alert, listening constantly. The forest felt alive now, but in a way that made me more aware of my vulnerability. Small sounds became louder, shadows longer. That afternoon, I decided to explore further. I wanted to see if there were other trails nearby. I packed water and some food, took my hiking stick, and headed into the forest. The woods were dense. The ground was uneven, roots protruding everywhere, rocks slick from occasional rainfall. I followed a faint trail, noting my route carefully. I came across animal tracks, more deer than anything else, and signs of bears. A large scratch on a tree, a tuft of fur caught on a branch. I didn't panic. I kept calm and walked carefully, making sure I stayed visible to any animals. Hours passed as I wandered deeper. I climbed over fallen logs, crossed a small stream on stones, and occasionally had to turn back when the path became too rough. The sun moved slowly across the sky, and shadows stretched. I decided it was time to return, but when I tried to retrace my steps, I realized I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. The trees looked familiar yet different, and the trail markers I thought I had seen were nowhere in sight. Panic crept in. I stopped, tried to get my bearings. I checked the creek map I had downloaded before leaving the cabin. The problem was that the forest was denser than it appeared on the map. I started walking in the direction I believed led back. Hours passed. The sun dipped low. The temperature dropped quickly, and I realized I had underestimated how long it would take to navigate back. I tried to stay calm, making mental notes of trees and rocks. Every sound now made me jump. A branch snapping under weight, a rustle in the bushes, the occasional caw of a crow. I knew I needed shelter soon. I couldn't risk getting lost in the dark. I remembered seeing a small overhang near a cluster of large rocks. I made my way there as twilight approached. I used a small knife to clear a bit of space, laid down my jacket and blanket, and tried to stay warm. The wind was stronger here, and the forest noises intensified. Every movement in the trees seemed like it could be a predator. I stayed awake most of the night, shivering and listening, imagining possible threats, and trying to conserve energy. By morning, I knew I had to find the cabin. I examined the sun's position and tried to estimate direction. I moved cautiously, marking my path with small stone piles as I went. Hours passed. My legs were sore, my throat dry, and I was hungry. But eventually, I heard it. The faint, familiar gurgle of the creek near the cabin. Relief washed over me. I followed the sound and eventually saw the clearing, then the cabin itself. It was intact, quiet, and welcoming in the morning light. I collapsed on the porch, breathing hard, exhausted but safe. I spent the rest of the day recovering, checking the cabin, ensuring nothing had been disturbed. I realized how quickly fear and vulnerability. I had been driving for hours when I finally reached the dirt road that led to the cabin. The sky was overcast, low gray clouds pressing down on the tops of the trees. I had rented the cabin online, a small wooden structure deep in the forest, far from towns, far from people. The description had promised peace, solitude, and a chance to be alone with nature. That had been exactly what I wanted. But I could feel unease as I parked my car, a cold wind whipping through the thin forest clearing where the cabin sat. The dirt beneath my tires was soft and damp, making a small cloud of dust as I stepped out. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. The cabin looked older than it had in the pictures. The wood was dark, worn, and splintered in places. The windows were dirty, some of the panes cracked, and the small porch sagged under its own weight. I checked the key I had been given, an old brass key that turned easily in the lock. The door opened with a creak, the sound echoing strangely in the empty space. Inside, the air was cold and musty, smelling of wood and old moisture. The furniture was sparse. A table and 2 chairs, a small bed, a stove in the corner, and shelves with dusty plates and pots. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if it hadn't been used in months. I dropped my bag on the floor and went to the window. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, thick and dark. I could hear the occasional snap of a branch or the distant caw of a bird. The wind shook the trees, making them groan softly. I reminded myself I was here to relax, to get away from work, from people, from everything. I unpacked slowly, methodically, hanging clothes in the small closet and putting my supplies on the counter. By the time I finished, the light outside had started to fade. The sky had darkened further, the clouds thicker, and the forest beyond the cabin was almost black. I built a small fire in the stove, the first warmth I had felt since stepping inside. The flames crackled, casting moving shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel both alive and empty at the same time. I sat at the table, eating a simple dinner I had brought, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. As night fully settled, I went to bed early. I wanted to get up before sunrise, to explore the area while it was still calm. I lay awake for a while, listening. There were sounds outside I didn't recognize. A rustle in the underbrush, the soft patter of something moving over fallen leaves, distant cracks of wood under some weight. At first, I told myself it was just deer, maybe a raccoon or a fox. But the more I listened, the more I felt something off. The sounds were too heavy, too deliberate, not random animals. I forced myself to sleep, telling myself I was being paranoid. I woke in the early hours to a sound that made my heart stop. Footsteps, outside, slow, deliberate, not hurried. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps circled the cabin, moving around the perimeter. I tried to convince myself it was another hiker, someone lost or someone checking the area, but the fear had already settled in my stomach like ice. I didn't dare go to the window. I waited, silent, every muscle tense, until the sound faded. It didn't take long, but it felt like hours. The next morning, I decided to stay inside until daylight fully broke. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The sun rose slowly, filtering through the trees, making the cabin feel slightly less oppressive. I made breakfast, but my appetite was gone. My mind was focused on the sounds from the night before. I tried to reason through it. Maybe I had misheard. Maybe the wind had made the branches move in a strange way, or maybe some animal had been on the roof. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been outside, watching. I decided to explore during the day, thinking that moving around and being outside might calm me. I packed a small bag with water, a flashlight, and a pocket knife. The forest was thick, the ground uneven with roots and fallen branches. Every step I took, I felt eyes on me, the air pressing in, making my skin crawl. I found an overgrown path and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead to a clearing or a stream. The path was narrow, tangled with vines and thorns. My clothes snagged, my shoes slipped in the mud, but I pressed on. Hours passed, and I began to feel exhausted. The sun was high, but the forest blocked most of the light, making everything dim. The air was heavy, humid, and filled with the smell of wet leaves and soil. I stopped to rest against a tree, wiping sweat from my brow. That's when I noticed something. Footprints. Human footprints. They were fresh, pressed deeply into the soft soil. My stomach turned. The prints were large, too large for me, and they were heading in the direction I had come from. I considered turning back, but then realized the prints led straight toward the cabin. My mind raced. I hurried back as fast as I could, but the forest seemed to stretch longer than before. Every snap of a branch under my foot made my heart leap. When I finally broke through the trees and saw the clearing with the cabin, my blood ran cold. The door was open. I hadn't left it open. The window nearest to the door was broken, a jagged hole in the glass. I froze, my hands shaking. Whoever had been outside had come in. I considered running, leaving everything behind, but the forest behind me was dense, and I had no idea which way led to safety. I stepped closer, slowly, keeping my eyes on the door. The inside of the cabin smelled of wet wood and something else, something faintly metallic. Blood. There were scratches on the walls near the door, deep, angry marks. The chair I had left by the table was overturned. My bag was gone. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I ran back toward my car, weaving through the trees, branches slapping my face and arms. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made me jump. I reached the clearing where I had parked and froze. My car was gone. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. The gravel of the driveway was undisturbed, except for footprints leading away from the cabin, deeper into the forest. I ran. I had no plan, no direction, just a desperate need to get out. The forest was a maze. Every turn looked the same. My legs burned, my lungs ached, and my shoes were filled with mud. I stumbled over roots and rocks, fell more than once, but I kept going, driven by a terror I had never known. The sun started to dip, shadows stretching long and dark, and I realized I might not make it out before nightfall. Just when I thought I would collapse from exhaustion, I saw a faint ribbon of light through the trees. It was a road, dirt and gravel, barely visible under leaves, but a road nonetheless. I ran toward it, my vision blurred, my body screaming for rest. As I reached it, I saw headlights in the distance. A car. I waved frantically, screaming, even though I doubted anyone could hear me through the forest. The car slowed and stopped. A man got out. He was older, with a calm presence that somehow made my shaking body feel slightly safer. I told him in broken, terrified words about the cabin, about the footprints, about how my car was gone. He listened, nodding, and offered to take me back to the main road where there was phone service. I followed him, every nerve still on fire, my mind running through every possible scenario of what could have happened, and what could have happened if I hadn't seen the footprints. Back on the main road, I finally got cell service. I called the local authorities, who sent a patrol to check the cabin. They found signs of forced entry and tracks leading far into the forest, but no one was found. My car was eventually located a few miles down a hidden logging trail, abandoned but mostly intact. Nothing of value was taken except my bag, and the authorities concluded it was likely the work of someone living rough in the woods, someone who had been observing the cabin and knew no one was around. I never returned to that area. The memory of the forest, the sounds at night, the cold presence outside the cabin, haunted me for months. I still dream about it sometimes. The dark trees pressing in, the footsteps circling, the cabin standing alone, silent and waiting. But I am alive, and I know exactly how quickly a peaceful escape can turn into a nightmare if you are truly alone in the woods. I learned to respect the forest, to respect how isolation can hide danger, and to always be prepared. Even a small mistake, a small moment of being unobservant, can make the difference between safety and being trapped in a situation you never imagined possible. The cabin still exists, I know. The path, overgrown and quiet, waits for the next person who thinks solitude is all they want. But I am careful now. I make sure someone knows where I am. I carry a phone with full battery. I leave markers along the trail. The memory of those footsteps in the night is a lesson burned into